My name is David, and today I'm going to tell you about the day I died for 4 minutes and how those 4 minutes changed everything I thought I knew about life, death, and what comes after. But to understand why what happened was so shattering, you need to understand who I was before that day. Before we go further, if this story challenges you or speaks to you, please subscribe to this channel, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment about your own journey with faith and doubt. Your story matters. I was 41 years old, living in Boston, working as a philosophy professor at a prestigious university. I'd built my entire career on rational thought, logical argumentation, and the firm conviction that everything could be explained through reason and science. And at the center of that worldview was one unwavering belief: God didn't exist. I wasn't quietly non-religious. I was an aggressive, outspoken atheist, the kind who debated Christians online, who wrote articles dismantling religious arguments, who considered faith a weakness of the mind, something people clung to because they couldn't handle the cold reality that when you die, you simply cease to exist. Lights out, nothing more. My colleagues knew me as the guy who could demolish any religious argument in under 5 minutes. My students feared my philosophy of religion class because I didn't just teach it objectively, I taught it with the explicit goal of deconstructing faith. And I was good at it, really good. Religion is the opiate of the masses, I'd quote Marx to my students. It's a security blanket for people who can't face the fact that life has no inherent meaning. We're cosmic accidents on a spinning rock. There's no grand plan, no loving God watching over us, no afterlife waiting for us, just this life, and then nothing. I'd reduced hundreds of believing students to doubt over my 15-year teaching career, and I was proud of it. Proud that I was freeing minds from what I saw as dangerous delusion. Proud that I was helping people face reality instead of hiding in comforting myths. My personal life reflected my philosophy. I'd been married once, briefly, in my 20s. It had fallen apart because, as my ex-wife had said, "You don't believe in anything beyond yourself, David. You think love is just chemical reactions, that commitment is just social conditioning, that everything beautiful is just biology. How can I build a life with someone who thinks we're nothing but matter in motion?" She was right. I did think that, and I saw no problem with it. Truth was truth, even if it was uncomfortable. I lived alone in a meticulously organized apartment in Cambridge. No kids. I'd never wanted them. Why bring more conscious beings into a meaningless universe, I'd argue. No close friends, really. Most people found my relentless rationalism exhausting. Just my books, my research, my teaching, and my writing. I'd published 3 books on atheism and secular philosophy. The most recent, The God Delusion, was a response to Richard Dawkins, arguing that even he wasn't atheistic enough, that he still clung to notions of meaning and morality that were just remnants of religious thinking. Some called me a nihilist. I preferred honest realist. I simply accepted what I believed the evidence showed. We're biological machines. Consciousness is an emergent property of brain activity. When the brain stops, consciousness stops. Death is the end, full stop. That worldview felt intellectually honest, brave even. I wasn't hiding from uncomfortable truths. I was facing reality head-on, without the crutch of religious fantasy. But that worldview, that carefully constructed, rationally defended, intellectually rigorous worldview, was about to be demolished in 4 minutes. It was a Tuesday morning in October. I was walking to campus, mentally rehearsing my lecture on Nietzsche's "God is dead" proclamation, when I felt a sharp pain in my chest. Not the gradual build-up you see in movies, just sudden, crushing pain that dropped me to my knees on the sidewalk. A heart attack at 41. I'd never had heart problems, never even considered the possibility. I was relatively healthy, didn't smoke, drank moderately, walked to work every day, but there I was, collapsed on a Cambridge sidewalk at 8:47 a.m., unable to breathe, pain radiating through my chest and down my arm. People gathered around me. Someone called 911. A woman, a medical student I later learned, started CPR. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was thinking, this is it. This is what death looks like. Just like I always said, you stop and that's it. Nothing comes next. At least I was right. And then I died. My heart stopped. 4 minutes and 37 seconds, according to the paramedics. Clinically dead. No heartbeat, no breathing, no brain activity registering on initial scans. And here's what I expected to happen. Nothing. Just cessation. The end of consciousness. Like a computer shutting down. Like a candle being snuffed out. Just darkness and non-existence. But that's not what happened. Instead, I experienced something I'd spent my entire adult life insisting was impossible, something I'd mocked, something I'd written papers refuting, something I'd confidently told hundreds of students was just wishful thinking and brain chemistry. I had what people call a near-death experience, but calling it that feels inadequate. Because what I experienced in those 4 minutes was more real, more vivid, more undeniably there than anything I'd experienced in my 41 years of conscious life. I wasn't just floating in some vague, dreamlike state. I was somewhere specific, somewhere impossible. And I wasn't alone. I saw him, Jesus. The figure I'd spent 15 years of academic work proving was either mythological or, at best, a misunderstood historical teacher whose followers had turned him into a god, and he spoke to me. Not in words exactly, but in a communication that was clearer than any verbal language I'd ever used. He showed me things about my life, about what I'd done, about what I'd denied, about the truth I'd spent decades running from. Those 4 minutes changed everything, shattered my worldview, destroyed my certainty, demolished my carefully constructed intellectual fortress against the possibility of God. And when the paramedics shocked my heart back to rhythm, when I gasped back into consciousness in the back of an ambulance, I wasn't the same David who'd collapsed on that sidewalk. I'd been dead, and in death I'd found what I'd denied all my life. The atheist philosopher who'd built his career on disproving God had met him face to face. And nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same. This is my story, the story of how 4 minutes of death taught me more truth than 41 years of life. The story of how the man who denied everything encountered the one he'd spent his life rejecting. The story of how I died an atheist and came back, something else entirely. I woke up in a hospital room 3 days later, not gradually, but all at once. Like being yanked from one reality into another. The fluorescent lights were too bright. The beeping of monitors was too loud. Everything felt harsh and abrasive compared to where I'd been. A nurse noticed I was awake and called for a doctor. Within minutes, my hospital room filled with medical staff checking vitals, shining lights in my eyes, asking me questions. Mr. Harrison, can you tell me your name? David Harrison. Do you know where you are? Hospital. Massachusetts General, I assume, based on proximity to where I collapsed. Do you remember what happened? And that's where I hesitated, because I remembered 2 things. I remembered collapsing on the sidewalk, the crushing pain in my chest, the medical student doing CPR. But I also remembered the other thing, the impossible thing, the thing my entire worldview said couldn't have happened. I had a heart attack, I said carefully. Yes. A severe one. You were clinically dead for 4 minutes and 37 seconds before the paramedics got your heart restarted. You're very lucky to be alive, Mr. Harrison. Lucky. The word felt absurd, given what I'd experienced. But I didn't say anything. How could I? How could I tell a room full of doctors and nurses, rational, scientifically minded medical professionals, that while I was dead, I'd met Jesus? They wouldn't believe me. Hell, 3 days ago, I wouldn't have believed me. Over the next 2 days, doctors ran tests, lots of tests. My heart had sustained significant damage. I'd need surgery, a bypass. But the doctors were more concerned about potential brain damage from oxygen deprivation. 4.5 minutes is a long time for the brain to be without oxygen, Dr. Chen, a neurologist, explained. We need to run cognitive assessments, make sure there's no impairment. They gave me tests, memory tests, logic puzzles, pattern recognition. And I passed them all easily. My brain was fine, physically at least, but mentally, psychologically, spiritually, I was absolutely not fine, because I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, about where I'd been, about what I'd seen, about him. I kept waiting for it to fade, for my rational mind to reassert itself and explain it away. Hallucination from oxygen deprivation, brain chemistry creating comforting illusions as it shut down. Exactly the explanations I'd given students when they'd asked about near-death experiences in my philosophy of religion class. The brain releases DMT when dying, I'd lectured confidently. It creates vivid hallucinations, tunnels of light, deceased relatives, religious figures, whatever your cultural conditioning has primed you to expect. It's neuroscience, not spirituality. But this didn't feel like a hallucination. It felt more real than the hospital room I was lying in, more real than any experience I'd ever had, and it wasn't what my cultural conditioning should have primed me to expect. I wasn't raised religious. My parents were secular academics. I'd never been to church except for a few weddings and funerals. I had no emotional attachment to Christianity. If anything, I'd spent 15 years actively hostile to it. So why would my dying brain create an encounter with Jesus? Why not just peaceful nothingness, which is what I'd believed in? Why not something from literature or philosophy, which had shaped my worldview far more than religion ever had? On my third day in the hospital, my department chair, Professor Margaret Walsh, visited. She was one of the few colleagues I'd call a friend, though even that was more professional courtesy than genuine closeness. David. My God, we were so worried. How are you feeling? Physically, recovering, mentally? I paused. Margaret, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you believe in God? She looked surprised. In all our years of working together, I'd never asked her about her personal beliefs. I'd assumed she was atheistic like most of our colleagues, or if she believed in something, she'd kept it private, knowing my stance. I'm agnostic, I suppose. Why do you ask? What about near-death experiences? What do you make of them? David, did you... She stopped, studying my face. Did something happen when your heart stopped? I wanted to tell her. Wanted to unload the whole impossible experience onto someone who might understand. But the words wouldn't come. Because telling her meant admitting that everything I'd built my career on might be wrong. That the atheist philosopher who'd written 3 books and taught hundreds of students that God was a delusion had, what? Hallucinated? Been wrong? Met God? The doctors say oxygen deprivation can cause hallucinations, I said instead. Margaret nodded slowly. That's the scientific explanation, yes, but David, you don't look like someone dismissing a hallucination. You look like someone who saw something that shook them. She was right. I was shaken. Fundamentally shaken in a way I'd never been in my life. After she left, I lay in that hospital bed staring at the ceiling, replaying those 4 minutes over and over in my mind. I remembered the moment my consciousness separated from my body. Not gradually, but instantly. 1 second I was on the sidewalk in pain, the next I was elsewhere. Above my body at first, watching the medical student doing compressions, watching the crowd gather, watching the paramedics arrive. And I remembered thinking, with absolute clarity, this can't be happening, I don't have a soul. Consciousness can't exist outside the brain, this is impossible. But impossible or not, it was happening. Then the scene had changed, not like transitioning in a dream, but like stepping through a doorway. Suddenly, I wasn't on a Cambridge street anymore. I was in a place that defied description, not because I lacked vocabulary, but because earthly language had no categories for what I experienced. Light, but not light from a source. More like light that was itself alive. Presence, but not just a presence. The presence, the source of everything, the ground of all being. Every philosophical concept I'd ever studied about the divine suddenly made sense in a way words never could. And then he was there. Jesus. I knew it was him not because he announced himself, but because I simply knew, the same way you know your own name. Undeniable, unavoidable, absolute. He didn't look like the paintings, didn't look like any artistic representation I'd ever seen. He was both more ordinary and more extraordinary than any depiction could capture, fully human and yet unmistakably divine. And his eyes, God, his eyes, they looked at me, into me, through me, seeing everything, every thought I'd ever had, every argument I'd made against his existence, every student I'd led away from faith, every arrogant lecture, every dismissive debate, everything. I'd expected judgment, condemnation, anger at the man who'd spent 15 years denying him, mocking him, leading others away from him. But what I saw in those eyes wasn't anger. It was something that broke me completely. Love. Profound, overwhelming, unconditional love, mixed with something else, grief, like he was mourning what I'd done to myself, what I'd done to others, not out of offense but out of genuine sorrow for the damage. And then he spoke, not in English, not in any audible language. But I understood perfectly, more perfectly than I'd ever understood anything. David, I know you. I've always known you. Every word you spoke against me I heard. Every argument you made I listened to. Every soul you led away from me I wept for. But I never stopped loving you. I never stopped calling you. I never stopped waiting for this moment. The communication wasn't just words. It was knowing, pure, unfiltered knowing downloading into my consciousness. I saw my life, every moment of it, but not from my perspective. From his. I saw myself at 7 years old, already questioning everything, already gravitating toward logic and reason, and I saw him there, watching, loving that curious mind he'd given me. I saw myself at 16, reading Nietzsche for the first time, feeling the thrill of intellectual rebellion, and I saw him there, patient, knowing this wasn't the end of my story. I saw myself in graduate school, writing my dissertation on the irrationality of religious belief, and I saw him there, present, even as I constructed arguments against his presence. I saw every lecture I'd given, every debate I'd won, every student whose faith I'd dismantled. And here's what shattered me. I saw his love for every single one of those students, saw how he'd been working in their lives even after I'd filled their minds with doubt. Saw how he'd never given up on them, just like he'd never given up on me, and I saw the cost. Not to him, though that was there too, the cross, the sacrifice I'd dismissed as mythology suddenly, horrifyingly real, but the cost to me, the emptiness of my life, the isolation I'd called independence, the cynicism I'd called honesty, the meaninglessness I'd called brave acceptance of reality. I saw what I'd run from, not just God, but love itself, connection itself, hope itself. I'd built a fortress of rationalism to protect myself from vulnerability, from need, from dependence on anything beyond my own mind. And in doing so, I'd locked myself in a prison. You denied me, he communicated, because you were afraid. Afraid that if you needed me, you'd be weak. Afraid that if you admitted there was something beyond yourself, you'd lose control. Afraid that surrendering to love meant surrendering your autonomy. So you built a philosophy that made your fear look like courage, your isolation look like strength, your emptiness look like honesty. Every word, every knowing struck like a hammer against glass. My worldview, so carefully constructed, so rationally defended, was shattering, because it was built on a foundation of fear, not truth, self-protection, not honest inquiry. But I created you for more than this, he continued. I created you for connection, for love, for purpose beyond yourself. I created you with that brilliant mind, not to use it against me, but to use it for me. To seek truth, real truth, not just the truth that keeps you safe from vulnerability. And then he showed me something else. A vision, not of what was, but of what could be. My life, but different, my intellect, but surrendered, my teaching, but used to point toward him instead of away from him, a version of David Harrison who'd said yes instead of no, who'd surrendered instead of resisted. who'd believed instead of denied. It was beautiful, purposeful, connected, everything my actual life wasn't. "It's not too late," he said. "This isn't the end. I'm sending you back, giving you another chance. You can continue as you were, denying, resisting, isolating, or you can surrender. Let me transform that brilliant mind. Let me give you the purpose you've been seeking in all the wrong places. Let me love you the way I've always wanted to love you." And then before I could respond, before I could process what was happening, I was back, gasping, pain, ambulance, paramedics, the harsh, abrasive reality of being alive in a broken body. But I wasn't the same, because I'd been there, I'd seen him, I'd heard him, I'd felt his love and his grief and his invitation. And now I was lying in a hospital bed, alive when I should be dead, faced with an impossible choice: deny what happened and return to my old life, or accept it and, what? Become everything I'd spent 15 years opposing. The atheist philosopher had met God, and nothing would ever be the same. The bypass surgery happened 5 days after my heart attack. The surgeon, Dr. Patel, explained the procedure with clinical precision, how they'd reroute blood flow around the blocked arteries, how the recovery would take months, how I'd need cardiac rehabilitation and lifestyle changes. "You're lucky," he said. "Most people who are down that long don't make it, or they have significant brain damage. You seem to have come through remarkably intact." Intact. The word was laughable. My brain might be functioning normally by their tests, but I was anything but intact. I was shattered. Everything I'd built my identity on for 41 years had been demolished in 4 minutes. The surgery went well. When I woke up in recovery, my first coherent thought was, "I'm still here." He really did send me back. Because part of me had wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, if the encounter with Jesus had been some elaborate dying dream that I'd constructed to make sense of my mortality. But waking up after surgery, I knew it had been real as the pain in my chest, as real as the monitors beeping around me. Recovery was slow: physical therapy, cardiac rehab, learning to walk without getting winded, learning to climb stairs again. My body was healing, but my mind was in turmoil. I tried to go back to my old thought patterns, tried to analyze the experience rationally, tried to find natural explanations. Temporal lobe stimulation can create feelings of presence, I told myself. Near-death experiences are well-documented neurological phenomena. Oxygen deprivation causes hallucinations. This doesn't prove anything. But even as I thought those words, I knew they were hollow. I was grasping for my old certainties like a drowning man grabbing for debris. Because accepting that it was real meant accepting that everything I'd believed was wrong, that everything I'd taught was wrong, that I'd spent 15 years leading people away from truth instead of toward it. The thought was crushing. 2 weeks after surgery, still recovering at home, I got a visit I hadn't expected. Professor Robert Chen, a colleague from the theology department. We debated each other publicly 3 times over the years, cordial but pointed exchanges where I'd argued against God's existence and he'd argued for it. "David, I heard about your heart attack. I wanted to check on you." "That's kind of you, Robert. Though I'm surprised you'd visit the campus Atheist. I imagine you have better uses for your time." He smiled gently. "You're a colleague, and regardless of our disagreements, I've always respected your intellect, even when I've disagreed with your conclusions." We talked for a few minutes about my recovery, about department gossip, about nothing important. Then he said something that caught me off guard. "David, can I ask you something? And please be honest. Did something happen when your heart stopped?" I stared at him. "What makes you ask that?" "Because I've seen that look before. On people who've had near-death experiences, that look of someone whose worldview has been fundamentally challenged. You have it." For a long moment I didn't respond. Then, almost against my will, the words came out. "What if I told you I met Jesus?" Robert didn't look surprised. He just nodded slowly. "What did he show you? You believe me? Just like that? No skepticism? No demand for evidence?" David, I've studied near-death experiences for 20 years. I've interviewed hundreds of people who've had them, including atheists and agnostics. Many of them came back changed. Some converted, some didn't. But almost all of them described encounters that were more real than ordinary reality. So yes, I believe you. And then, for the first time since it happened, I told someone the whole story. Everything, the separation from my body, the place I went, Jesus, his eyes, his words, the life review from his perspective, the vision of what could be, the invitation to surrender. Robert listened without interrupting, his expression serious but compassionate. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" he finally asked. "I don't know. Robert, my entire career is built on atheism. I've written books, I've taught thousands of students, I've built a reputation as someone who can dismantle religious arguments. How do I come back from that? How do I stand in front of a classroom and teach philosophy of religion after this? The same way you did before, except now you're teaching from a different perspective. David, you were never afraid of following evidence wherever it led. At least that's what you always claimed. So where is this evidence leading you? To something impossible, to something that destroys everything I've built. Or, Robert said gently, to something true. David, you've spent 15 years arguing that intellectual honesty requires rejecting God. But what if intellectual honesty now requires accepting what you experienced? What if the most rational thing you could do is acknowledge that your naturalistic worldview was incomplete? His words haunted me after he left, because he was right. I'd always prided myself on following evidence, on being intellectually honest, on not letting comfort or wish fulfillment cloud my judgment. But now I was doing exactly what I'd always criticized religious people for doing, rejecting evidence because it was uncomfortable, because it didn't fit my pre-existing worldview, because accepting it would cost me everything I'd built. The irony was almost funny, almost. That night, alone in my apartment, I did something I hadn't done since I was a child. I prayed, not the desperate prayer of the dying, but a conscious, intentional prayer. God, Jesus, I don't even know how to do this. I've spent 41 years denying you. I don't know how to talk to you. I don't know how to believe in you. But I can't deny what happened. I can't pretend it didn't happen just because it's inconvenient. So if you're real, and you must be real because I met you, I need help. I need to know what to do with this, because I have no idea how to move forward. I didn't hear a voice, didn't see a vision, but I felt something. Peace, subtle but real, like a gentle presence saying, I'm here. I've always been here. We'll figure this out together. Over the next month, as my body continued healing, I began what I can only describe as an intellectual and spiritual investigation. I approached it the way I'd approached my doctoral dissertation. Systematically, thoroughly, honestly. I read everything I could find on near-death experiences, the scientific literature, the skeptical explanations, the testimonies of others who'd had them. And I found something that surprised me. The research was far more ambiguous than I'd realized. Yes, there were naturalistic explanations, oxygen deprivation, DMT release, temporal lobe activity, but those explanations had significant gaps. They couldn't account for veridical perceptions, cases where people accurately described events they shouldn't have been able to see. They couldn't explain the profound life changes that followed. They couldn't address the consistency of experiences across cultures and belief systems. I'd dismissed all of this before, waved it away as anecdotal evidence, not rigorous enough for serious consideration. But now I was reading it with different eyes, with the eyes of someone who'd experienced it himself. I also started reading theology, real theology, not the strawman versions I'd constructed in my lectures. I read C.S. Lewis, whom I'd always dismissed as simplistic. I read Aquinas, whose arguments I'd never seriously engaged with. I read Augustine, Anselm, Plantinga, Swinburne, and I was shocked by how sophisticated the arguments were, how intellectually rigorous, how much more nuanced than the caricatures I'd presented in my classes. I told my students that religious belief was intellectually lazy, that it was believing without evidence, that it required checking your brain at the door. But reading these theologians, many of them with philosophical credentials that matched or exceeded mine, I realized I'd been the lazy one. I'd constructed easy targets and knocked them down. I'd never seriously engaged with the strongest versions of religious arguments because I'd been afraid they might actually be compelling. 6 weeks after my heart attack, I got a call from Margaret Walsh. "David, the department needs to know. Are you coming back for spring semester? It starts in 3 weeks, and we need to arrange coverage for your classes if you're not ready." I'd been avoiding this question, avoiding the decision I knew I'd have to make. "Margaret, I need to ask you something. Hypothetically, if a professor's views changed significantly, changed in a way that contradicted their previous work, what would happen?" There was a long pause. "David, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that what happened when I died wasn't a hallucination. It was real, and I can't teach philosophy of religion the same way I used to teach it. I can't stand in front of students and argue that God doesn't exist when I've met him." Another pause. "David, you're talking about a complete reversal of your academic position, your books, your papers, your reputation. Are you prepared for the consequences of that?" "No, but I'm also not prepared to live a lie. I built my career on intellectual honesty, on following evidence, and the evidence I have now, personal, experiential evidence, points to something I spent 15 years denying. How can I ignore that and still claim to be intellectually honest? The university won't fire you for changing your views. But David, your colleagues will question your credibility. Your students will feel betrayed. Your critics will have a field day. Are you ready for that?" I thought about it, really thought about it, about what I'd be giving up. My reputation as the campus atheist, my identity as the rational skeptic, the respect of colleagues who shared my naturalistic worldview. But I also thought about what I'd gain: truth, integrity, the possibility of a life that wasn't built on denial and isolation. "I'm not ready," I said honestly, "but I'm going to do it anyway, because I met Jesus, Margaret. I died and I met him, and he showed me that everything I believed was built on fear, dressed up as rationalism. I can't unknow that. I can't pretend it didn't happen. So yes, I'm coming back spring semester, but I'm coming back changed, completely changed." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment, feeling the weight of what I'd just committed to. I'd essentially just ended my career as I knew it. The atheist philosopher who converts to Christianity? I'd be a laughingstock, a cautionary tale. Proof that even smart people can be deluded by near-death experiences. But I'd also finally be honest. For the first time in my adult life, I'd be living in alignment with what I actually believed to be true, rather than what I wanted to be true, or what was professionally convenient to believe. That evening, I opened my laptop and started writing. Not an academic paper, not a rebuttal of my previous work, just a document for myself, a record of what happened and why it mattered. I titled it, "What I Saw When I Died, a Philosopher's Account of Meeting Jesus." I wrote about the heart attack, about those 4 minutes, about Jesus and what he showed me, about the life review and the invitation to surrender, about the intellectual crisis that followed, about the choice I was now making. And as I wrote, I felt that peace again, that gentle presence, like Jesus was sitting beside me, reading over my shoulder, saying, "Yes, this is what it means to follow me." Not because it's easy or convenient or professionally advantageous, but because it's true, and truth matters more than comfort. I didn't know what would happen when I returned to teaching, didn't know how my colleagues would react, didn't know if I'd lose my position or my credibility or both, but I knew I'd met Jesus. I knew he'd shown me truth, and I knew I couldn't deny that and still call myself intellectually honest. The atheist philosopher was dead. He died on a Cambridge sidewalk on a Tuesday morning in October, and in his place was, what? A Christian philosopher, a convert, a believer. I didn't have the words yet, didn't have the categories, didn't know how to navigate this new identity. But I was ready to try, ready to follow the evidence wherever it led, even if it led to the very thing I'd spent 15 years denying. Because I'd seen his eyes, I'd felt his love, I'd heard his invitation, and I'd said yes. Even if I didn't fully understand what that yes would cost me, I knew it was the only honest response to what I'd experienced. The journey was just beginning, and I had no idea where it would lead. But I knew I wasn't walking it alone, because he'd promised, "I'm sending you back. We'll figure this out together." And for the first time in my life, I was learning what it meant to trust someone beyond myself. The first day back teaching was 3 months after my heart attack. I stood outside the classroom door, my hand on the handle trying to steady my breathing. Not from the physical exertion, my heart had healed enough for that, but from sheer terror. This was Philosophy 301, Philosophy of Religion, the same course I'd taught for 12 years, the same course where I'd systematically dismantled religious arguments and congratulated students for abandoning their faith, the same course that had made my reputation as the campus atheist. But I wasn't that person anymore, and the students on the other side of that door didn't know that yet. I opened the door and walked in. 23 students. Mostly juniors and seniors, some I recognized from previous classes, all of them looking at me with curiosity. Their professor, who'd nearly died, who'd been gone all fall semester, now finally back. "Good morning," I said, setting my materials on the desk. "For those who don't know me, I'm Professor Harrison. For those who do know me, I should tell you up front, this class is going to be different than you might expect, different than I've taught it before." A student I recognized, Tyler, a vocal atheist who'd taken my Introduction to Philosophy course last year, raised his hand. "Different how, Professor?" I took a deep breath. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading and preparing for. As most of you probably heard, I had a heart attack last October. I was clinically dead for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. I paused, and during those 4 minutes, I had an experience that has fundamentally changed my worldview. I had what's called a near-death experience. I encountered Jesus Christ, and that encounter was real enough and compelling enough that I can no longer teach this course from the perspective of atheistic naturalism. The classroom went completely silent. Students stared at me, mouths open. Tyler looked like I'd slapped him. Now I continued. I understand that many of you took this class expecting a critical examination of religious belief from a skeptical perspective. That's what I've provided for 12 years, but I can't do that anymore, not honestly. Instead, I'm going to teach this course as an honest investigation into the philosophy of religion, examining arguments for and against God's existence, exploring different religious traditions, and grappling with questions about faith, reason, and religious experience, including my own. A young woman in the front row raised her hand tentatively. "Professor Harrison, are you saying you're a Christian now?" "I'm saying I'm someone who met Jesus when I died and can't pretend that didn't happen. What that makes me, Christian, believer, convert, I'm still figuring out. But I can't stand in front of you and argue that God doesn't exist when I've experienced otherwise." Tyler stood up abruptly. "This is unbelievable. I took this class because you were supposed to be intellectually honest, and now you're telling us that because you had some hallucination while your brain was oxygen deprived, we're supposed to take religion seriously." His words stung, but I'd expected them. "Tyler, sit down, please. You raise a fair point, and it's one I've thought about extensively. Let me address it." He sat, arms crossed, face skeptical. "You're right that oxygen deprivation can cause hallucinations," I said. "I've made that exact argument myself in this very classroom, but here's what I've learned from 3 months of investigating my own experience. The naturalistic explanations, while plausible, don't adequately account for everything I experienced. The veridical perceptions, the profound and lasting transformation, the encounter with a being whose knowledge exceeded my own and who showed me things I couldn't have known. That's not evidence," Tyler shot back. "That's anecdotal experience. You taught us that personal experience isn't reliable evidence for truth claims. I did teach you that. And it's still true that personal experience alone isn't sufficient for public proof of metaphysical claims. But Tyler, here's what I was wrong about. I taught you that personal experience was irrelevant to the formation of rational belief, that only publicly verifiable evidence mattered. But that's an impossible standard for many of the most important questions we face. Questions about consciousness, meaning, love, morality, these all involve subjective experience that can't be reduced to purely objective measurement. I walked to the whiteboard and wrote, Epistemology of Religious Experience. This semester we're going to explore a question I used to dismiss. Can religious experience provide rational warrant for belief in God? I used to say no, categorically. Now I'm not sure, and I'm going to teach you why I'm not sure, and let you draw your own conclusions. Another student raised her hand. Professor, I'm a Christian, and honestly, I took this class expecting you to tear apart my faith like you did to my roommate last year. Are you saying you're not going to do that? I'm saying I'm not going to approach religious belief from a position of contempt. I spent 12 years teaching from the assumption that religious people were either stupid or dishonest or both. I'm ashamed of that now. This semester, we'll examine religious claims with the rigor they deserve, which means taking them seriously enough to engage with the strongest versions of religious arguments, not just straw-man versions that are easy to knock down. The class period continued with more questions, more challenges, more confusion. By the time it ended, half the students looked intrigued. The other half looked betrayed. Tyler was the last to leave. He stopped at my desk. Professor Harrison, I looked up to you. You showed me it was okay to reject religion, to embrace atheism intellectually. And now you're abandoning everything you taught us? Tyler, I'm not abandoning intellectual rigor. I'm applying it to my own experience. I had an encounter that contradicted my worldview. I could either explain it away to preserve my pre-existing beliefs, or I could take it seriously and revise my worldview accordingly. Which of those is more intellectually honest? The first one. Because you're letting a subjective experience override objective rationality. Am I? Or am I recognizing that rationality itself rests on certain experiences, like our experience of logical coherence, of moral intuitions, of consciousness itself? Tyler, I used to believe exactly what you believe, but I've learned that our confidence in materialism was based on excluding data that didn't fit. That's not honest inquiry. That's ideology. He shook his head. I can't believe this. You've lost your credibility, Professor. Everyone's going to know that David Harrison, the famous atheist philosopher, got scared when he almost died and converted to Christianity. That's weakness, not truth-seeking. His words hit hard because they echoed my own fears. You might be right. That might be how people interpret it. But Tyler, let me ask you something. If you had an experience that contradicted your deepest beliefs, what would you do? Would you have the courage to follow it wherever it led? Or would you dismiss it to preserve your worldview? He didn't answer, just gathered his things and left. I sat at my desk after he'd gone, feeling the weight of what I'd done. I'd just alienated half my class. Word would spread. The philosophy department would talk. My reputation as a serious academic was probably over. But I'd also told the truth, and that had to count for something. That afternoon, I had a meeting with the department chair, Margaret Walsh. Her office was filled with books and papers, the organized chaos of an active scholar. David, I've already heard from 3 students about your class this morning. 2 were excited. 1 was threatening to file a complaint about religious indoctrination. Let me guess. Tyler Morrison? How did you know? Because he's me 3 months ago. Confident in atheism, dismissive of religious experience, certain that anyone who believes is intellectually compromised. I was his hero, Margaret, and I just shattered his trust. She studied me carefully. Are you okay? This can't be easy. It's not, but it's necessary. Margaret, I can't teach philosophy while ignoring the most significant experience of my life. That wouldn't be philosophy, that would be ideology. I understand, but David, you need to be careful. You're walking a very fine line. This is a secular university. You can teach about religious experience, but you can't proselytize. You can share your own experience as a case study, but you can't use your position to convert students. I'm not trying to convert anyone. I'm trying to examine religious claims honestly, including my own experience as data. Isn't that what philosophy is supposed to do? Follow evidence wherever it leads. In theory, yes. In practice, you're challenging a lot of assumptions that this institution is built on. Naturalism, secular rationality, the idea that religion is separate from serious academic inquiry. You're going to face pushback. I know, but Margaret, I died. I met Jesus. How can I pretend that didn't happen and still call myself a philosopher? How can I advocate for following evidence while ignoring the evidence of my own experience? She sighed. I don't have an answer to that, but I'll support you as much as I can. Just be prepared. This is going to get harder before it gets easier. She was right. Over the next month, word spread across campus. David Harrison, the atheist philosopher, had converted to Christianity after a near-death experience. The reactions ranged from curiosity to contempt. Some colleagues were genuinely interested. Robert Chen, the theology professor, became an unexpected ally, meeting with me weekly to discuss theology and answer the hundreds of questions I had about Christian belief and practice. "You're approaching this like a philosopher," he observed one afternoon, "systematically analyzing doctrines, examining historical evidence, constructing logical frameworks. It's admirable, but David, faith isn't just intellectual assent to propositions. Then what is it? It's relationship, trust, surrender. You met Jesus, right? Did he give you a theological argument, or did he show you who he was and invite you into relationship with him?" The question stopped me. Because Robert was right. Jesus hadn't convinced me through logical proofs. He'd revealed himself, shown me love, invited me to trust him. "But I'm a philosopher," I protested. "I think in arguments and evidence and logical coherence. How do I reconcile that with faith?" "You don't have to abandon reason, David. But you might need to recognize its limits. Reason can point toward God, but it can't capture him completely. At some point, you have to trust. You have to take the leap. You have to stop analyzing and start experiencing." His words challenged me deeply. Because I'd spent 41 years trusting only my own reasoning, surrendering that control even to God felt terrifying. But I'd also seen where that self-reliance had led me, to isolation, cynicism, and a worldview so narrow it couldn't account for my own experience. Around this time, I started attending church for the first time in my adult life. Robert invited me to his church, a small Episcopal congregation near campus. I felt absurdly self-conscious walking through those doors, the famous atheist philosopher coming to church. What if someone recognized me? What if students saw me there? But no one seemed to care. They were welcoming but not intrusive. The liturgy was beautiful in a way I hadn't expected, ancient words carrying weight and meaning I was just beginning to understand. The sermon that first Sunday was about doubt. The pastor, a woman in her 50s named Reverend Sarah Mitchell, talked about Thomas, the disciple who doubted Jesus' resurrection until he could see for himself. "We often call him Doubting Thomas, like it's a criticism," she said. But Jesus didn't condemn Thomas for his doubt. He met him in it. He showed up and said, "Put your hand in my wounds, touch and see. Don't be faithless but believing." Jesus doesn't demand blind faith. He invites honest questioning. He meets us in our doubt. The words landed like a physical touch, because that was exactly what Jesus had done with me. I'd doubted him for 41 years. I'd argued against him. I'd led others away from him. And when I died, he didn't condemn me for that doubt. He met me in it, showed me the truth I'd been running from, invited me to believe. After the service, I approached Reverend Sarah. "I'm David Harrison. I teach philosophy at the university. I'm new to this, to church, to faith, to all of it." She smiled warmly. "I know who you are. Robert told me you might visit. How can I help? I don't know what I'm doing. I had this experience, a near-death experience where I met Jesus, and it was real, more real than anything I've ever experienced, but I don't know how to be a Christian. I don't know the theology. I don't know the practices. I don't even know if I'm supposed to call myself a Christian yet." "David, can I tell you something? You're already further along than you think. You know the most important thing, that Jesus is real, that he loves you, that he invited you into relationship with him. Everything else, the theology, the practices, the identity, that's just learning how to live in response to that truth. You don't have to have it all figured out. But I'm a professor. I'm supposed to have things figured out. I'm supposed to be an expert. You're an expert in philosophy, but in faith, you're a beginner. And that's okay. Actually, it's more than okay. Jesus said we have to become like children to enter the kingdom. Children don't have everything figured out. They just trust. Trust. That word again. The thing I'd spent my whole life avoiding, because it meant surrendering control. "I don't know how to trust," I admitted. "I've built my whole life on relying only on what I can verify and understand. Trusting someone I can't see, can't measure, can't prove to others, it feels like intellectual suicide." "Or," Revi, Sarah said gently, "it feels like the most intellectually honest thing you could do. You experience something that your previous worldview couldn't account for. You're revising your beliefs in light of new evidence. That's not intellectual suicide. That's exactly what rational people should do when they encounter data that contradicts their theories." She was right. I'd spent 3 months feeling like I was abandoning rationality for faith. But maybe I was actually doing the opposite, abandoning an ideology that pretended to be rationality for an honest assessment of all the evidence, including experiential evidence. That night, I knelt by my bed, a posture that felt ridiculous and necessary at the same time, and prayed. "Jesus, I met you. I know I did. And I'm trying to figure out what that means, trying to learn how to believe in you, trust you, follow you. But I'm scared. Scared of looking foolish. Scared of abandoning reason. Scared of surrendering control. Scared that I'm making the biggest mistake of my life. But I'm more scared of denying what I experienced, of living a lie for the rest of my life, of choosing comfort over truth. So I'm asking, help me. Show me how to trust you. Show me how to believe. Show me how to live in light of what you showed me when I died. Because I can't do this on my own. I've tried to do everything on my own for 41 years, and it led me to a life of isolation and emptiness. I don't want that anymore. I want what you showed me was possible. I want relationship. I want purpose. I want truth. I want you. So here I am, scared and confused and way out of my depth, but I'm here, and I'm saying yes to whatever you're calling me to, even if I don't understand it yet, even if it costs me everything, because you already gave me everything when you sent me back, when you showed me I didn't have to live in that prison of self-sufficiency and rational pride, when you showed me love. Thank you for that. Thank you for meeting me. Thank you for not giving up on me even when I spent 41 years running from you. I'm not running anymore. I'm here, and I'm yours, whatever that means, however messy it gets. I'm yours. And as I prayed those words, I felt it again, that peace, that presence, that gentle assurance that I wasn't figuring this out alone. Jesus was with me, just like he'd promised. The atheist philosopher was learning to trust, learning to believe, learning to surrender, and the journey, difficult as it was leading somewhere beautiful, somewhere true, somewhere home. 6 months after my heart attack, I stood in front of a very different kind of audience. Not students in a classroom, but 200 people gathered at a local church for what they called a testimony night, an evening where people shared stories of how God had worked in their lives. Reverend Sarah had invited me. "David, people need to hear your story. Not just the academic version you're working through in class, but the personal one, what actually happened, what it meant, what it's costing you. I'd resisted at first. I'm not ready. I'm still figuring all this out. I don't even know if I'm qualified to call myself a Christian yet. That's exactly why you should share, because most people think you have to have everything figured out before you can talk about faith. But your story shows that faith starts with encounter, with experience, with saying yes to Jesus even when you don't understand everything yet. So there I was, notes in hand, heart racing, about to tell my story to a room full of strangers. Many of them probably knew my reputation. The atheist professor, the one who'd spent years arguing against everything they believed. I began simply. My name is David Harrison. 6 months ago, I was a philosophy professor who'd built his entire career on atheism. I wrote books arguing that God didn't exist. I taught students that religious belief was intellectually dishonest. I was confident, certain, and completely wrong. I told them about the heart attack, about dying on that Cambridge sidewalk, about expecting nothing, just cessation of consciousness, exactly as I'd always taught. But that's not what happened, I continued. Instead, I experienced something I'd spent 15 years insisting was impossible. I had a near-death experience, and in those 4 minutes, while my heart wasn't beating, I met Jesus Christ. I saw people leaning forward, fully engaged. Some had tears in their eyes already. I described the encounter, not in the academic language I used in class, but in raw, honest terms. The separation from my body, the indescribable place I went, the presence of Jesus, his eyes that saw everything. His love that broke me, his invitation to surrender. He showed me my life from his perspective, I said. Every lecture I'd given against him, he'd been there. Every student whose faith I'd dismantled, he'd grieved over. Every argument I'd made, he'd listened to. And instead of the condemnation I deserved, he showed me love, profound, overwhelming, unconditional love. My voice cracked. I'd spent 41 years running from him, building intellectual fortresses against him, convincing myself and others that he didn't exist. And when I finally met him face to face, he didn't reject me. He welcomed me. He showed me that everything I'd been looking for, meaning, purpose, connection, had always been available in him. I'd just been too proud to admit I needed it. I talked about the aftermath, the intellectual crisis, the choice to be honest about my experience even though it meant professional suicide. The first terrifying day back in class. The students who felt betrayed, the colleagues who questioned my sanity. I've lost a lot in the past 6 months, I admitted. My reputation as a serious atheist philosopher is gone. Half my students think I've lost my mind. Some colleagues won't even make eye contact with me anymore. I'll probably never get another book published by a major academic press. My career, as I knew it, is essentially over. I paused, looking out at the audience. But I've gained so much more. I've gained truth. I've gained relationship with Jesus. I've gained a community of believers who are teaching me what it means to trust and surrender. I've gained hope that life isn't just a meaningless accident on a spinning rock. I've gained the knowledge that when I die, really die permanently, I'll be going home to someone who loves me. After I finished, during the question and answer time, a young man about 25 raised his hand. Professor Harrison, I'm a graduate student in physics. I've been an atheist my whole adult life, and your story terrifies me. Why does it terrify you? Because if it's true, if you really met Jesus, if near-death experiences are actually glimpses of the afterlife, then I've been wrong about everything, and I don't know how to deal with that. I understood that fear intimately. I know exactly how you feel. I felt the same way lying in that hospital bed. But here's what I learned. Being wrong about God isn't the worst thing that can happen to you. Living your whole life without him is. I spent 41 years being brilliant and successful and accomplished and utterly empty. Don't make my mistake. Don't wait until you're dead to discover truth. An older woman asked, how did you know it was really Jesus? How do you know it wasn't just your brain creating what you expected to see? 2 reasons, I said. First, it wasn't what I expected to see. I expected nothing. I believed death was the end. If my brain was going to create a comforting hallucination, why would it create an encounter with someone I'd spent 15 years denying? Second, the encounter was too specific, too personal, too knowing. Jesus showed me things about myself I'd never admitted to anyone. He knew me in a way that no construct of my own mind could. It wasn't a hallucination. It was an encounter with someone who existed independently of my thoughts. After the event, dozens of people came up to me. Some thanked me for my honesty. Some shared their own stories of doubt and faith. Some asked for advice on reconciling science and religion. But one conversation stood out. A man about my age, dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, waited until everyone else had left. "Professor Harrison, my name is Marcus. I'm a former student of yours. I took your philosophy of religion class 7 years ago." I felt my stomach drop. "I'm sorry. I'm sure You destroyed my faith," he said bluntly. "I came into your class as a Christian. I left as an atheist. Your arguments were so compelling, so rational, so intellectually rigorous that I couldn't defend my beliefs. I felt stupid for ever having believed in God. Marcus, I'm so sorry. He held up his hand. "Let me finish. I spent the next 5 years as an atheist. I was miserable, lost, searching for meaning in materialism and finding nothing, until 2 years ago, when my father died of cancer. And on his deathbed he told me he was going to be with Jesus. He had this peace, this certainty, this joy, even in dying. And I realized he had something I didn't have, something your philosophy couldn't give me. What happened? I started investigating Christianity again, but this time not from a position of defensiveness, from a position of honest seeking, and I found my way back to faith. Not blind faith, but thoughtful faith, faith that engaged with doubts instead of ignoring them. That's beautiful, and I'm genuinely sorry for... Don't apologize, because here's the thing, hearing your story tonight, hearing that you met Jesus, that the professor who destroyed my faith has now found faith himself, it's confirming something I've been believing for 2 years, that God is real, that Jesus is who he said he was, that everything I'd learned to dismiss was actually true. He extended his hand. "Thank you, Professor, for destroying my faith 7 years ago, and for rebuilding it tonight." I shook his hand, overwhelmed. God had taken my worst mistake, leading students away from faith, and somehow was redeeming it, using even that for good. The next day, I met with Robert Chen at a coffee shop near campus. I told him about Marcus's story. "God's redemption is like that," Robert said. "He doesn't just fix our mistakes. He transforms them into something purposeful. Your years as an atheist professor weren't wasted, David. They were preparation. You learned to think rigorously. You learned to engage with skeptical arguments. You learned the questions that keep people from faith. And now you can use all of that, not to lead people away from God, but to show them a path back to Him. But I feel so unqualified. I've only been a believer for 6 months. I don't know theology. I don't know the Bible. I barely know how to pray. How can I help anyone when I'm still such a beginner? Because you're honest about being a beginner. David, do you know what turns most skeptics away from Christianity? Not our arguments. Most skeptics never seriously engage with our arguments. What turns them away is perceived intellectual dishonesty. Christians who pretend they have no doubts, who give pat answers to complex questions, who act like faith is easy. And I'm not doing that? You're doing the opposite. You're saying, I had this profound experience. I believe it was real, but I'm still wrestling with what it means. I still have questions. I still struggle with doubt sometimes, and that's okay. That honesty is incredibly powerful. It gives skeptics permission to explore faith without pretending to have certainty they don't feel. His words encouraged me, but I was still struggling with something deeper. Robert, I need to ask you something. How do you know Christianity is true? Like, really true? I had this experience with Jesus. That's convinced me he's real. But how do I know Christianity has the right understanding of who he is? How do I know the Bible is reliable? How do I know church doctrine is correct? Robert smiled. Those are excellent questions, and they're questions you should ask. Faith isn't blind, David. It's trust based on reasons. So let me ask you, what are you reading? Besides philosophy? Not much. I've been so focused on processing my experience that I haven't done much theological study. Then let's fix that. I'm going to give you a reading list. Historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection, biblical scholarship on the reliability of the New Testament, philosophical arguments for Christian theism. Not because you need to prove Christianity to believe it. You've already encountered Jesus personally, but because intellectual satisfaction matters for someone with your mind. You need to know that your experience aligns with historical and philosophical evidence. Over the next 3 months, I dove into that reading list. N.T. Wright's The Resurrection of the Son of God, Gary Habermas on the historical Jesus, Richard Bauckham on the eyewitness testimony in the Gospels, William Lane Craig on the cosmological and moral arguments, Timothy Keller on the reason for God. And I was surprised by what I found. The evidence for Christianity, when I actually examined it honestly instead of dismissing it a priori, was far stronger than I'd realized. The historical case for Jesus' resurrection, the manuscript evidence for the New Testament's reliability, the philosophical coherence of Christian theism. I'd spent 15 years telling students that religious belief required abandoning reason. But I was discovering that my rejection of Christianity had been the unreasonable position, rejecting evidence without serious examination because it contradicted my materialistic assumptions. Around this time, I also started meeting regularly with Reverend Sarah for what she called spiritual formation. It was basically her teaching me how to be a Christian, how to pray, how to read the Bible, how to participate in Christian community. "You're approaching this very analytically," she observed one day, "which makes sense given your background. But David, Christianity isn't just a set of propositions to believe. It's a relationship to cultivate, a way of life to practice, a transformation to undergo." "I don't know how to do that," I admitted. "I know how to analyze arguments. I don't know how to cultivate relationship with someone I can't see." Start with prayer, not just intellectual prayers asking for understanding, but conversational prayers. Talk to Jesus like you'd talk to a friend. Tell him about your day, your struggles, your questions, your fears, your joys. That feels silly, like talking to myself. Does it feel like talking to yourself when you sense his presence in response, when you feel that peace you described, that gentle assurance? She was right. When I actually prayed, really prayed, not just recited words, I did sense a response. Not audible words, but a knowing, a presence, a connection. "Here's another practice," Reverend Sarah continued. "Read the Gospels, not as historical documents to analyze, but as introductions to a person. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John aren't just biographies. They're portraits of Jesus painted by people who knew him. Read them asking, who is this person? What is he like? How does he interact with people? Get to know him through those stories." I started reading the Gospels that way, and I was struck by things I'd never noticed before in my previous academic study. Jesus' compassion for the marginalized, his patience with doubters like Thomas, his frustration with religious leaders who cared more about rules than people, his love for those society rejected. I saw myself in those stories. In the Pharisees who thought they had God figured out through their intellectual systems, in Thomas, who needed to see before he could believe, in the disciples who constantly misunderstood what Jesus was doing. And I saw Jesus' response, not condemnation, but patience, not rejection, but invitation, not harshness, but gentleness. One night, reading John's Gospel, I came to the story of Nicodemus, the religious teacher who came to Jesus at night in secret with questions. Jesus told him, "Very truly, I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again." Nicodemus was confused. How can someone be born when they are old? Surely they cannot enter a second time into their mother's womb to be born. Jesus answered, Very truly I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless they are born of water and the Spirit. Flesh gives birth to flesh, but the Spirit gives birth to spirit. You should not be surprised at my saying, you must be born again. I sat with that passage for a long time. Born again. That's what had happened to me, wasn't it? The old David Harrison, the atheist philosopher, the intellectual cynic, the isolated skeptic, had died on that Cambridge sidewalk, and someone new had been born, someone who believed, someone who trusted, someone who was learning to surrender. I wasn't the same person I'd been 6 months ago. I'd been reborn. That night, I prayed differently than I'd prayed before. Jesus, I'm starting to understand. What happened to me wasn't just a near-death experience. It was a death and resurrection. The old me died, and you gave me new life. You didn't just show me truth. You made me new. Thank you for that. Thank you for not just correcting my wrong beliefs, but transforming my whole being. Thank you for being patient with how long it's taking me to learn how to live in this new life. Keep teaching me. Keep transforming me. Keep showing me who you are. Because I'm just beginning to understand how much I have to learn, how far I have to grow, how much change is still ahead. But I'm not afraid of that anymore, because you're with me. You've been with me through every step of this journey, and you'll be with me through every step still to come. I'm yours, Jesus, completely yours. Transform me into whoever you created me to be, not the self-sufficient intellectual I tried to be, but the person who lives in relationship with you, who trusts you, who follows you, even when I don't understand, even when it's hard, even when it costs me everything, because you already gave me everything when you gave me yourself. Thank you for meeting me, for saving me, for changing me, for giving me new life. 6 months after dying for 4 minutes, I was learning what it meant to live, really live. Not the empty existence I'd called life before, but abundant life, life connected to its source. Life lived in relationship with the one who created it. The atheist philosopher had died, and in his place was someone new, someone still learning, still growing, still transforming, but someone who was finally, truly alive. The journey was far from over, but I was no longer walking it alone. Jesus was with me, and that made all the difference. 1 year after my heart attack, I stood in front of my philosophy of religion class on the first day of the fall semester. It was my 3rd time teaching this course since my near-death experience, and the dynamics had shifted dramatically from that first terrifying day. Word had spread across campus. Students now took my class specifically because of my story. Some believers wanting to learn from a former skeptic, some skeptics curious about what could convert someone like me, some just fascinated by the intellectual journey. This semester's class had 32 students, the largest enrollment the course had ever had. Welcome to Philosophy of Religion, I began. Many of you know my story, that I died for 4 minutes and had an experience that changed everything I believed. But this class isn't about converting you to my beliefs. It's about rigorous philosophical investigation of religious claims. We're going to examine arguments for and against God's existence. We're going to explore the problem of evil. We're going to investigate religious experience as a source of knowledge. And we're going to do all of it with intellectual honesty, following evidence wherever it leads, even if it challenges our pre-existing beliefs. I paused, looking around the room. Some of you are believers. Some are skeptics. Some are uncertain. All of you are welcome here. The only thing I ask is that you engage honestly with the material and with each other. Don't dismiss arguments because they're uncomfortable. Don't cling to positions just because they're familiar. Be willing to be wrong. That's what real philosophy requires. A student raised his hand. Professor Harrison, do you still consider yourself a philosopher? Or are you now a theologian who happens to teach philosophy? It was a fair question. I'm a philosopher who had an experience that philosophical materialism couldn't account for. So I revised my worldview to accommodate the evidence. That's what philosophers are supposed to do. The fact that my revised worldview includes God doesn't make me less of a philosopher. It makes me more honest about the limits of naturalistic explanations. The semester unfolded with an energy I hadn't experienced in my previous teaching. Debates were passionate but respectful, students engaged deeply with the material, and I found myself learning as much from their questions as they learned from my teaching. But the most significant development came midway through the semester, when the university's atheist student group invited me to speak. The invitation came from their president, a philosophy major named Emma, whom I'd taught 2 years ago. She'd been in my class when I was still a confident atheist. Now she wanted me to address their group about my conversion experience. "We're not trying to ambush you," she wrote in the email, "but our members are confused. You were the one professor we could point to and say, 'See, smart people don't believe in God, and now you do. We need to understand why, and we need to hear your arguments for why we should still be atheists if you're not.'" I accepted the invitation, and on a Thursday evening, I walked into a lecture hall filled with about 60 students, all self-identified atheists or agnostics, all there to hear their former champion explain his defection. Emma introduced me with an honesty I appreciated. "Professor Harrison used to be our hero. He taught us that rational people don't believe in God, that religious faith is intellectual surrender, that near-death experiences are just brain chemistry, and then he had a near-death experience himself and apparently decided all of that was wrong. Tonight he's going to try to explain why. And we're going to try very hard to listen with open minds, even though most of us think he's made a terrible mistake." The room chuckled nervously. I stepped to the podium. "Thank you, Emma. And you're right, I did teach all of those things. I believed them completely. And if you'd asked me a year and a half ago what I'd do if I had a near-death experience, I would have said, recognize it as a hallucination and dismiss it accordingly. So I understand your confusion, because I'm confused too, in some ways. I didn't want this to happen. I didn't go looking for a religious experience. It found me, and I've spent the past year trying to make sense of it." I told them the story, the same one I'd told at the church testimony night, but framed for this very different audience. I didn't use religious language or assume they'd accept supernatural explanations. I just described what happened and acknowledged the philosophical problems it created. "Here's my dilemma," I said. "I had an experience that felt more real than any experience I've had in waking life. An experience that was phenomenologically rich, coherent, and transformative. An experience that included information I couldn't have known through normal means. And an experience that has produced lasting, positive changes in my life. Increased compassion, decreased anxiety, greater sense of purpose and meaning." Now, the materialist explanation is that this was all just brain chemistry, neurons firing in patterns that created the illusion of transcendent experience. And I acknowledge that's possible. Oxygen deprivation does weird things to the brain. Near-death experiences can be explained neurologically. But here's the problem. That explanation requires me to dismiss the phenomenological evidence, what I actually experienced, in favor of a theoretical framework that I adopted before having any relevant data. I'd be saying, I know my experience felt real, but it couldn't have been real because materialism is true. That's not following evidence. That's protecting a worldview, a student interrupted. "But Professor, we have to dismiss phenomenological evidence all the time. People have dreams that feel real but aren't. People hallucinate. People misinterpret their experiences. Personal experience is unreliable. You taught us that. I did teach you that. And it's true that personal experience can be unreliable. But Emma," I turned to her, "do you believe you're conscious right now?" "Of course." "Why? You can't prove your consciousness to me. I can't observe it scientifically. All I have is your report of your subjective experience. By the standard of personal experience is unreliable, I should dismiss your claim to be conscious as unverifiable. But we don't do that. We accept that consciousness is real based on first-person phenomenological evidence." "That's different," Emma said. "Consciousness is a normal experience. Near-death experiences are extraordinary claims. Fair point. Carl Sagan's principle: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But here's what I've learned. The evidence for the reality of near-death experiences is far stronger than I realized when I was dismissing them. Veridical perceptions during cardiac arrest, consistent reports across cultures, lasting transformative effects. These aren't proof, but they're evidence that deserves serious consideration rather than a priori dismissal. Another student raised her hand. Professor Harrison, let me be blunt. Don't you think it's more likely that your brain, deprived of oxygen and flooded with neurochemicals, created a comforting hallucination? Isn't that a simpler explanation than I actually went to another realm and met Jesus? It would be simpler, yes, and for most of my life, I chose simpler explanations over more complex ones. But simplicity isn't always the same as truth. The question isn't, what's the simplest explanation? It's, what's the best explanation given all the evidence? And when I honestly examine all the evidence, phenomenological, historical, philosophical, I find that theism, specifically Christian theism, provides a better explanation than materialism. But you're biased now, someone called out. You had an experience that convinced you. You've lost your objectivity. You're absolutely right. I am biased. But so are you. You're biased toward materialism. I was too, for 41 years. The question is, which bias is more rationally warranted? I'm biased because I had an experience that contradicted my previous worldview, and I chose to revise my beliefs accordingly. You're biased because you've adopted a worldview that requires dismissing any evidence that contradicts it. Which of us is actually being more intellectually honest? The room erupted in debate. Students arguing with each other, with me defending materialism, questioning it, wrestling with the implications. Finally, Emma stood up. Okay, everyone, let's let Professor Harrison finish, but I have one more question. Professor, if you're wrong, if this was all just a hallucination, what would convince you of that? What evidence would make you return to atheism? It was the most important question of the night. I thought carefully before answering. If I found evidence that my experience was entirely explicable through known neurological mechanisms without any residual mystery, if I discovered that the veridical perceptions I thought I had were actually false memories, if the transformation in my life proved to be temporary or harmful rather than lasting and beneficial, if the historical and philosophical case for Christianity fell apart under scrutiny, any of those things would make me reconsider. But here's the thing, Emma. I'm not afraid of being wrong anymore. I spent 41 years being certain I was right, and that certainty was actually intellectual arrogance. Now I'm willing to be wrong. I'm following the evidence as best I can. If better evidence emerges, I'll follow that. But right now, the best explanation for my experience and for the totality of evidence is that I actually encountered Jesus. And intellectual honesty requires me to believe what the evidence suggests, even when it's uncomfortable. After the talk, Emma approached me. Professor, I'm not convinced. I still think you had a hallucination. But I respect that you're at least trying to be intellectually honest about it. Most religious converts I know just say you have to have faith and shut down any questioning. You're still thinking, still analyzing, still open to being wrong. That's something. Thank you, Emma. And I hope you'll stay open too. Not to conversion necessarily, but to the possibility that your materialistic framework might be incomplete. That there might be more to reality than matter and energy. That consciousness might point to something beyond just brain states. She nodded, thoughtful. I'll think about it, I promise. Walking home that night, I reflected on how much had changed in a year. I'd gone from teaching atheism with absolute confidence to defending theism with humble uncertainty. From dismissing religious experience to validating it, from intellectual arrogance to intellectual humility. And I was happier, genuinely happier. Not the shallow contentment I'd felt when winning debates, but deep joy rooted in connection, to God, to others, to purpose beyond myself. Around this time, something unexpected happened. I received an email from a major Christian publisher asking if I'd consider writing a book about my experience. The Philosopher Who Met God, an atheist's journey through death to faith. My first instinct was to decline. I was still so new to Christianity, still figuring things out, still making mistakes. Who was I to write a book? But Robert Chen encouraged me. David, your newness is exactly what makes you qualified. You remember what it's like to be an atheist. You understand the intellectual barriers. You can speak to skeptics in a way that lifelong Christians can't, and your willingness to admit uncertainty, that's refreshing. Most Christian apologetics books are written with false certainty. Yours would be honest about the struggle. I spent 3 months writing the book, not as an academic treatise, but as a personal narrative interwoven with philosophical reflection. I told my story, the heart attack, the experience, the aftermath, but I also engaged seriously with the philosophical questions it raised. Can near-death experiences provide evidence for life after death? How do we evaluate subjective experience as a source of knowledge? What's the relationship between reason and faith? How do we respond when experience contradicts our worldview? I didn't pretend to have all the answers. I admitted my doubts, my uncertainties, my ongoing struggles with questions that had no easy resolutions. But I also made a clear case. My experience was real. It pointed to truth beyond materialism, and intellectual honesty required me to follow that evidence even when it cost me everything. The book published 6 months later, 18 months after my heart attack. The response was overwhelming. Atheists were divided. Some said I'd betrayed rationalism. Others said I'd been more rational than most believers because I'd followed evidence even when it contradicted my pre-existing beliefs. Some skeptics read it and remained unconvinced, but appreciated the intellectual honesty. A few reached out to say it had started them on their own journey of reconsidering materialism. Christians loved it. They appreciated that I took skeptical objections seriously instead of dismissing them, that I admitted doubt, that I didn't pretend conversion made everything easy. The book became required reading in several seminary courses on apologetics and evangelism. But the most meaningful responses came from individuals whose stories echoed mine. A neuroscientist who'd had a near-death experience and been afraid to talk about it professionally. A physicist who'd been questioning materialism but felt isolated in his field. A philosophy professor at another university who'd been secretly exploring Christianity but hadn't come out about it. Their emails all said versions of the same thing. Thank you for being honest. Thank you for showing that intellectual rigor and religious faith aren't incompatible. Thank you for being willing to lose your reputation to follow truth. One email particularly moved me. It was from Tyler Morrison, the student who'd walked out of my first class after my conversion, who'd accused me of losing my credibility. Professor Harrison, I owe you an apology. When you came back to teaching and told us about your near-death experience, I was angry. I felt betrayed. I thought you'd abandoned rationality for comforting delusion. But I've been watching your journey over the past year and a half. I've seen you engage honestly with skeptical objections. I've seen you admit uncertainty. I've seen you lose professional respect but gain intellectual integrity. And I've started to wonder, maybe you're more rational now than you were when you were a certain atheist. Maybe admitting you might be wrong is actually braver than claiming certainty. I'm still an atheist, but I'm a less certain one than I was. And I think that's progress. Thank you for modeling what intellectual honesty actually looks like. I read that email 3 times, tears in my eyes. Because that was all I'd hoped for, not to convert everyone, but to show that following evidence wherever it leads, even to uncomfortable conclusions, is what real philosophy demands. Around the same time, my relationship with the church deepened. I'd been baptized 6 months ago, a public declaration of faith that felt both terrifying and necessary. Reverend Sarah had baptized me herself, and I'd wept through the entire ceremony. Now I was being asked to teach an adult Sunday school class on faith and reason. Me, barely a year old in faith, teaching others. It felt presumptuous. "You're exactly the right person," Reverend Sarah insisted. "You know the questions skeptics ask because you asked them for 41 years. You know the intellectual barriers because you built them yourself. You can help people who are struggling with doubt because you've been there." Oh, the class attracted an interesting mix. Long-time Christians who'd never seriously examined why they believed, seekers who were curious about Christianity but had intellectual objections, and former skeptics like me who were early in their faith journey. I taught it the way I taught my university class, with rigorous honesty, admitting when I didn't know answers, exploring objections seriously rather than dismissing them. We looked at historical evidence for the resurrection, philosophical arguments for God's existence, the problem of evil, the relationship between science and faith, and I shared my own story repeatedly, not as proof, but as testimony. This is what I experienced. This is why I believe it was real. This is how it changed me. But you have to evaluate it for yourself. You have to follow your own evidence wherever it leads. One woman in the class, a biochemist named Dr. Lisa Chen, told me after several weeks, "I've been a Christian my whole life, but I never really examined why. I just accepted what I was taught. Your class is teaching me to think about my faith, to have reasons for what I believe. It's making my faith stronger, not weaker." That was the goal, not blind faith, but thoughtful faith, not certainty without evidence, but trust based on reasons. Not intellectual suicide, but intellectual humility that recognized reason's limits while still valuing reason's insights. 18 months after dying for 4 minutes, I had a life I never could have imagined, teaching philosophy with renewed purpose, writing about faith and reason, helping skeptics and believers alike think more deeply, connected to a community of people pursuing truth together. I'd lost my reputation as a hardline atheist. I'd lost some colleagues' respect. I'd lost the certainty that had defined my identity for 41 years. But I'd gained truth. I'd gained relationship with Jesus. I'd gained purpose beyond intellectual achievement. I'd gained joy rooted in something more stable than professional success. That night, I prayed with gratitude I felt in every cell of my body. "Jesus, 18 months ago, I died. And you gave me new life. Not just physical life, though thank you for that too, but spiritual life, real life, life connected to its source. Thank you for meeting me when I was running from you. Thank you for showing me love when I deserved judgment. Thank you for transforming my intellectual arrogance into humble seeking. Thank you for using even my years of atheism for good, teaching me to think rigorously, to engage with skeptics, to value honesty over comfort. Thank you for the students who are watching my journey and learning that faith and reason can coexist. Thank you for the skeptics who are reconsidering their certainty. Thank you for the believers who are learning to think more deeply about what they believe. I don't know what comes next. I don't know if I'll write more books or just keep teaching. I don't know if I'll face more professional consequences or if acceptance will come. I don't know how much I'll grow in understanding or how long I'll struggle with doubts. But I know you're with me. I know that whatever comes, I'm not facing it alone. I know that the life you're building in me is better than the life I built for myself. So I'm yours, completely yours, for whatever purpose you have, in whatever way you want to use me. Thank you for death that led to life. Thank you for darkness that led to light. Thank you for the 4 minutes that changed everything. Thank you for meeting me, for saving me, for never giving up on me. I'm home now, finally home. After 41 years of running, I'm home, and I'm never leaving again. The atheist philosopher had become a believing professor. The skeptic had become a seeker. The cynic had become someone who hoped. And the journey, beautiful, difficult, transformative, continued, one step at a time, one question at a time, one surrender at a time, following Jesus into whatever came next, trusting that he really had gone before me, into death, into life, into everything. 2 years after my heart attack, I received an invitation that seemed impossible to speak at a major academic conference on consciousness and near-death experiences. The conference was organized by the International Association for Near-Death Studies, and the audience would include neuroscientists, psychologists, philosophers, and researchers from around the world. The invitation came with a note from the conference organizer. Professor Harrison, your unique perspective as both a philosopher and someone who's experienced clinical death would be invaluable to our discussions. We're not asking you to defend religious interpretations of NDEs. We're asking you to present your experience honestly and engage philosophically with the various explanatory models. I almost declined. 2 years into this journey, I was still learning, still growing, still wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Who was I to speak at an international conference? But Robert Chen convinced me otherwise. David, you have something most researchers don't. You've lived both sides. You know the materialist explanations intimately because you taught them. And you know the experiential reality because you've lived it. That's exactly what this conference needs. So I accepted. And 3 months later, I found myself in a conference center in San Francisco about to present to 400 researchers and academics. My presentation was titled The Epistemology of Near-Death Experience, a Philosopher's Case Study. Indeed, I'd prepared meticulously, knowing this audience would be far more critical than church testimony nights or even my atheist student group. I began with the philosophical framework. When we evaluate near-death experiences, we face a fundamental epistemological question. How do we weigh subjective phenomenological evidence against theoretical explanatory frameworks? Do we privilege first-person experience or third-person neurological models? And what do we do when the two seem to conflict? I presented my own experience not as proof, but as a case study. I described the clinical details, 4 minutes and 37 seconds of cardiac arrest, the medical interventions, the successful resuscitation. Then I described the phenomenological details, the separation from my body, the realm I experienced, the encounter with a being I identified as Jesus, the life review, the transformative impact. Here's what makes this philosophically interesting, I continued. I went into this experience with a fully developed materialist worldview. I had no religious background, no emotional investment in religious belief. In fact, I had the opposite. My entire career was built on atheism. So the standard explanation that NDEs are culturally conditioned hallucinations doesn't easily apply. My cultural conditioning should have produced either nothing or perhaps some non-religious transcendent experience. Instead, I encountered Jesus. A figure I'd spent 15 years arguing was mythological. I then walked through the various naturalistic explanations: oxygen deprivation, DMT release, temporal lobe activity, REM intrusion, and acknowledged their plausibility while also pointing out their limitations. None of these explanations adequately account for veridical perceptions during cardiac arrest. None explain the consistent, transformative effects across vastly different individuals. And none address the subjective certainty that experiencers feel, the sense that this was more real than ordinary reality. These aren't decisive refutations, but they are gaps in the materialist account. The question and answer session was intense. A neuroscientist from MIT challenged me, "Professor Harrison, you're committing a basic error, treating the vividness of an experience as evidence for its reality. Hallucinations can feel extremely real. That doesn't make them real." You're absolutely right," I said. "Phenomenological vividness alone doesn't establish reality, but it also doesn't establish unreality. The question is, when we have a phenomenologically vivid experience that conflicts with our theoretical framework, which do we privilege? I spent 41 years privileging theory over experience. I'm now suggesting that was methodologically unjustified. "It is," a psychologist asked, "how do you respond to the accusation that you're cherry-picking evidence, that you accept your NDE as real because it supports conclusions you now want to believe, while dismissing naturalistic explanations that you'd have accepted before your experience?" That's a fair accusation, and I've thought about it extensively. But here's my response. I'm not dismissing naturalistic explanations. I'm saying they're incomplete. They account for some aspects of the phenomenon, but leave significant questions unanswered. And yes, my experience has changed what I find plausible. But isn't that how rational revision should work? We encounter new data, we revise our priors, we update our beliefs. The alternative is to hold our theoretical framework immune to revision, regardless of experience. After my presentation, several researchers approached me privately. A physician who'd studied NDEs for 20 years said something that stuck with me. "Professor Harrison, I've interviewed hundreds of people who've had near-death experiences, and I've noticed a pattern. The skeptics who have them often become the strongest believers, not because they're less rational, but because the contrast between their expectations and their experience is so stark. You expected nothing, you experienced something. That gap is harder to dismiss than for someone who already believed in an afterlife. But not everyone was supportive. A philosophy professor from UC Berkeley cornered me during a break. "David, I knew your work before this incident. You were a serious thinker, and now you've become exactly what you used to criticize, someone who lets subjective experience override rational analysis. It's disappointing." "Professor Williams, can I ask you something? Have you ever had an experience that contradicted your deepest beliefs? An experience so powerful it made you question your entire worldview?" "No, and I'm grateful for that. It's allowed me to maintain philosophical consistency. Or, I suggested gently, it's allowed you to maintain a worldview that's never been tested. I thought I had philosophical consistency, but it was only consistent because I'd never encountered data that challenged it. When I did, I had to choose, protect my consistency or follow the evidence. I chose evidence. That seems like the more philosophical approach to me." He walked away without responding, and I felt the familiar ache, the cost of honesty, the price of following truth wherever it led. That evening, I had dinner with a group of NDE researchers. The conversation turned to the interpretive frameworks people use to make sense of their experiences. "It's interesting," one researcher observed. "Christians tend to see Jesus. Hindus tend to see figures from their tradition. Atheists like you, David, are more varied. Some see nothing despite being resuscitated. Some have transcendent experiences without religious content. And some, like you, encounter religious figures despite having no prior belief." "What do you make of that?" I asked. "It could support a cultural conditioning hypothesis, that our expectations shape what we experience. But it could also support a perennialist view, that there's a transcendent reality that different traditions describe in their own languages. Or it could support your Christian interpretation, that Jesus meets people where they are, in forms they can recognize, but is uniquely real regardless of cultural background. How do we determine which interpretation is correct? We can't, not empirically. That's the frustrating thing about NDEs. They provide subjective data that's real to the experiencer, but unprovable to others. We're stuck evaluating competing frameworks based on which best accounts for all the evidence: phenomenological, neurological, historical, philosophical. "And which framework do you think best accounts for the evidence?" She smiled. "I'm agnostic, literally. I think the data is ambiguous enough that honest people can disagree. But I will say this: your interpretation isn't intellectually dishonest. It's a reasonable inference from your experience, especially given how it's transformed you. The proof, if there is proof, is in the transformation." Her words reminded me of something Jesus had said in the Gospels: "You will know them by their fruits." The evidence for the reality of an encounter with God isn't just in the phenomenological experience, but in the lasting change it produces. And I had changed, profoundly, in ways that went far beyond intellectual belief. 2 years ago, I'd been isolated, cynical, living for professional achievement and intellectual superiority. Now I had genuine relationships. I served at church. I mentored students, not to make them think like me, but to help them think for themselves. I gave to causes I would have dismissed as sentimental before. I prayed, I worshipped, I lived in community. The transformation wasn't complete. I still struggled with pride, with wanting to win arguments, with intellectual arrogance. But I was aware of those struggles now, and I was working on them with God's help and the support of Christian community. After returning from the conference, I had a conversation with Reverend Sarah that challenged me in a new way. David, you've been a Christian for 2 years now, and you've done remarkable work integrating your intellect with your faith. But I want to ask you something. How's your heart? What do you mean? I mean, you've thought deeply about whether Christianity is true. You've examined the evidence. You've revised your philosophical positions. But have you let Jesus into the broken places? The places that aren't about intellectual questions, but about emotional wounds and relational patterns? I was quiet because she was right. I'd approached Christianity largely as an intellectual project, analyzing arguments, reading theology, teaching classes. But had I really let Jesus heal the deeper wounds? Tell me about your marriage, she said gently. You mentioned it ended years ago. Have you dealt with that loss? Have you brought that pain to Jesus? I hadn't, not really. I'd mentioned it in passing when telling my story, but I'd never actually grieved it with God. Never asked Jesus to heal the wounds my ex-wife had identified. The inability to connect deeply, the reduction of love to chemicals, the emotional isolation. David, intellectual conversion is important, but it's not enough. Jesus doesn't just want your mind. He wants your whole self, your heart, your wounds, your relationships, your emotions. You've given him your intellect, but you're still holding back parts of yourself. Over the next months, I began what Reverend Sarah called inner healing work. I met with a Christian counselor who specialized in helping people process past wounds in the context of faith. And I started bringing to Jesus not just my questions, but my pain, the pain of my failed marriage, the loneliness of 41 years of self-imposed isolation, the wounds from my father's emotional distance, the fear of vulnerability that had driven me to intellectualize everything. It was harder than any philosophical problem I'd ever tackled, because it required admitting need, admitting brokenness, admitting I couldn't think my way out of these wounds. One session with my counselor, Tom, particularly broke me open. He asked me to imagine Jesus in the room with me and to tell him about my deepest fear. I'm afraid of being vulnerable, I admitted, tears starting. My whole life, I've protected myself by staying in my head, by analyzing everything, by never letting anyone close enough to hurt me. And even now, even after meeting Jesus, even after 2 years of faith, I'm still doing it. I'm intellectualizing my relationship with God instead of actually being in relationship with Him. What do you think Jesus wants to say to you about that? Tom asked. And suddenly, not in Tom's voice, but in my heart, I heard or felt a response. I know. I've always known. You built walls to protect yourself, and they became a prison. But I'm not asking you to tear them all down at once, just one brick at a time. Just trust me with one wound, then another, then another. I'm patient. We have time. I wept. Not sad tears, but tears of release. Because I'd been so afraid that Jesus would be impatient with my slowness, frustrated with my emotional guardedness, disappointed that I wasn't transforming faster. But He wasn't. He was patient, gentle, willing to meet me where I was and walk with me toward wholeness at whatever pace I could manage. Around this time, something unexpected happened. My ex-wife Jennifer reached out. We hadn't spoken in over 10 years. Her email was brief. David, I heard about what happened to you, about your heart attack and your change. I'd like to talk if you're willing. I have some things I need to say. We met at a coffee shop in Cambridge. She looked older, but well, happier than I remembered her being during our brief marriage. David, I've been following your story from a distance, the book, the talks, the transformation, and I want to say, I'm glad. I'm glad you found what you were looking for, because when we were married, you were so empty, so isolated, So afraid of needing anyone? I know. I'm sorry for that, for what our marriage became, for how I failed you. I didn't reach out for an apology. I reached out to tell you something. When our marriage ended, I was angry. I blamed you for being emotionally unavailable. But over the years, I've realized I was asking you to give me something you didn't have to give. You couldn't love well because you didn't believe in love. You couldn't connect because you didn't believe connection was real. You couldn't be vulnerable because you thought vulnerability was weakness. That's all true, and I'm sorry you bore the cost of my brokenness. But David, that's the thing. Reading your book, seeing how you've changed, it gives me hope. If you could change this much, if God could reach someone as closed off as you were, then maybe real transformation is possible. Maybe people really can become new. That's beautiful, and I'm grateful you're sharing it. We talked for 2 hours. Not reconciliation. Too much time had passed, too much had changed, but healing, forgiveness, the closure neither of us had found when our marriage ended. Can I ask you something? She said as we were leaving. Do you really believe you met Jesus? Like, actually met him? Or is it possible it was just your brain creating what you needed? Jennifer, I'm a philosopher. I've examined this question from every angle. Could it have been just my brain? Theoretically, yes. But the evidence, the phenomenological reality, the veridical perceptions, the transformation that followed, the coherence with historical Christianity, all of it points to something more than just neural activity. I really believe I met him, as much as I believe I'm sitting here with you now. She nodded slowly. I believe you believe it. And honestly, seeing how it's changed you, made you capable of connection, of vulnerability, of actually being present with another person. That's evidence in itself. The old David couldn't have had this conversation. He would have been analyzing it, defending himself, staying in his head. But you're here, really here, that's new. Walking home from that conversation, I felt something shift. A weight I'd been carrying for over a decade, guilt over the failed marriage, shame about my emotional unavailability, lifting. Jesus was healing not just my intellect, but my heart. Not just my beliefs, but my relationships. Not just what I thought, but who I was. That night, I prayed differently than I'd prayed before. Jesus, thank you for being patient with me, for not demanding I change all at once, for meeting me in my intellectual questions and my emotional wounds, for transforming not just what I believe, but who I am. I've spent 2 years focusing on the intellectual side of faith, analyzing arguments, writing books, teaching classes, and that was necessary. But now I'm ready for the deeper work, the heart work, the healing of wounds I've carried for decades. Thank you for the conversation with Jennifer, for the closure I didn't know I needed, for using even my failures for good, for showing me that transformation is possible, not just intellectual but emotional, relational, spiritual. Keep changing me, keep healing me, keep making me into someone who can actually love instead of just analyzing love, someone who can connect instead of just theorizing about connection, someone who can be vulnerable instead of hiding behind intellectualization. I trust you with this process, even when it's painful, even when it requires facing wounds I'd rather keep buried, even when it means tearing down walls I spent 41 years building, because you showed me something when I died, that life without you is just existence, and I don't want to just exist anymore. I want to really live, fully, openly, vulnerably, connected to you and to others. Thank you for death that led to life, and thank you for continuing to bring life, deeper, richer, truer life every day. I'm yours, not just my mind but my heart, not just my intellect but my emotions, not just my beliefs but my whole self. Transform all of it. I trust you, completely. 2 years after dying for 4 minutes, I was learning what it meant to truly live, not the half-life of intellectual achievement and emotional isolation I'd lived before, but abundant life, connected life, vulnerable life, healed life. The atheist philosopher had become a believing professor, but more than that, he was becoming a whole person, and the journey, difficult and beautiful, continued. One wound at a time, one brick removed from the wall at a time, one step toward wholeness at a time, following Jesus not just with my mind but with my heart, trusting him not just intellectually but emotionally, surrendering not just my beliefs but my brokenness, and discovering that he was faithful. Every step of the way, he was faithful. 3 years after my heart attack, I stood in the same hospital where I died, Massachusetts General. But this time, I wasn't a patient. I was a visitor, invited by the hospital chaplaincy to speak with cardiac patients who'd had near-death experiences and were struggling to make sense of what they'd encountered. The hospital's head chaplain, Father Michael Torres, had reached out after reading my book. We get patients all the time who've had these experiences during cardiac arrest or surgery. Most of them are confused, scared, unsure whether to trust what they experienced. Some dismiss it immediately. Others become obsessed with it. Very few have someone who can help them process it from both a philosophical and personal perspective. So there I was, walking the same halls I'd been wheeled through 3 years ago, about to meet with a patient who'd coded during surgery and had an experience that was shaking his entire worldview. His name was James Morrison, a 62-year-old engineer who'd been an atheist his entire adult life. Father Michael briefed me before I went in. He had a massive heart attack during a routine procedure, was clinically dead for almost 6 minutes, saw something during that time that he can't explain, and he's terrified because everything he believed says it shouldn't have happened. I knocked on the door of his hospital room. "Mr. Morrison, I'm David Harrison." Father Michael thought we should talk. He looked at me with a mix of hope and suspicion. "You're the philosophy professor, the one who had the near-death experience and became religious." "That's me. How are you feeling?" "Physically, recovering, mentally, completely disoriented." "Dr. Harrison, I'm an engineer. I've spent 40 years designing systems, analyzing problems, finding rational solutions. And what happened to me, it doesn't fit any rational framework I have." "Tell me about it." He described an experience remarkably similar to mine, the separation from his body, a sense of moving through darkness toward light, an encounter with a presence he couldn't identify but felt was profoundly loving and knowing, a life review where he saw his actions from a different perspective, and then being sent back with a clear sense that it wasn't his time yet. "The thing is," he said, his voice shaking, "I don't believe in God. I never have. I've always thought religion was for people who couldn't handle reality. But this felt more real than anything I've ever experienced. How do I reconcile that?" I sat down in the chair beside his bed. "I know exactly how you feel. 3 years ago, I was lying in a hospital bed asking the same questions. I'd spent 15 years teaching that near-death experiences were hallucinations, and then I had one, and it was undeniably real. So what did you do?" "I investigated. I read everything I could about NDEs, the scientific explanations, the phenomenological reports, the philosophical implications. I talked to researchers, to other experiences, to skeptics and believers. And ultimately, I had to decide, was I going to trust my experience or dismiss it to preserve my worldview? And you chose to trust your experience." "I did, because the alternative was intellectual dishonesty. I'd spent my career advocating for following evidence wherever it leads. My experience was evidence, subjective, personal evidence that I couldn't dismiss just because it was inconvenient." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm terrified of what my colleagues will think, of what my family will say. I have a reputation as a rational person. If I start talking about having a spiritual experience, they'll question your sanity. Some will dismiss you. Some will be uncomfortable. I know because I've lived through all of that. 3 years later, I still have colleagues who won't make eye contact with me, students who think I've lost my credibility. But James, I have to ask you, is their comfort more important than your honesty? Is your reputation more valuable than truth? I don't know. Maybe. I've built my whole identity on being the rational one. So had I. But here's what I learned. Real rationality isn't refusing to believe anything that challenges your assumptions. Real rationality is revising your beliefs when you encounter new data. You've encountered data, powerful, experiential data. The question is whether you'll have the courage to take it seriously. We talked for over an hour. I shared my journey, the intellectual crisis, the decision to be honest despite the cost, the slow process of building a new worldview that could accommodate both reason and spiritual experience. I didn't try to convert him, just showed him that it was possible to be both intellectually rigorous and open to transcendent reality. As I was leaving, he said, "Thank you. I don't know what I'll do with all this, but it helps to know I'm not crazy, that someone else who valued reason had a similar experience and found a way forward. You're not crazy. You're someone who encountered something beyond the material world. What you do with that encounter, that's up to you. But whatever you decide, be honest. That's the only way to maintain integrity." Over the next year, I had similar conversations with dozens of cardiac patients. Some dismissed their experiences after our talks. Some explored them cautiously. A few, like James, eventually embraced faith. But all of them benefited from having someone who understood both the experience and the intellectual struggle. This work became increasingly central to my sense of calling. I was still teaching philosophy, still writing, still speaking at conferences, but the hospital visits felt different, more personal, more immediate, more directly connected to the encounter that had changed my life. Around this time, I received an unexpected letter. It was from the publisher of my first atheist book, written 15 years ago, The Rationalist's Guide to Religious Delusion. They wanted to publish a 20th anniversary edition with a new foreword. "Given your well-publicized change of views," the editor wrote, "we think it would be fascinating for you to write a new introduction addressing how you now view your earlier work. It would make for compelling reading, the author himself critiquing his own arguments from the perspective of his transformed worldview." My initial reaction was horror. Republish the book where I'd most aggressively attacked religious belief. The book I was now deeply ashamed of. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like an opportunity to model intellectual humility, to show that revising beliefs in light of new evidence isn't weakness, but wisdom. I agreed. And I spent a month writing a 10,000-word introduction that didn't just critique my earlier arguments, but examined why I'd made them in the first place. I wrote about the intellectual arrogance that had driven my atheism, the certainty that I had it all figured out, that anyone who disagreed was either stupid or dishonest. I wrote about how I'd constructed strawman versions of religious arguments because I was afraid of engaging with the strongest versions. I wrote about how my materialism had been more ideology than honest inquiry, but I also acknowledged what I'd gotten right. My emphasis on evidence and reason, my insistence that beliefs should be examined critically, my refusal to accept propositions without justification. These were good philosophical instincts. I'd just applied them selectively, exempting my own materialistic assumptions from scrutiny. I was right to value reason, I wrote. I was wrong to think reason alone was sufficient for understanding all of reality. I was right to demand evidence for claims. I was wrong to define evidence so narrowly that entire categories of human experience, consciousness, meaning, love, spiritual encounter, were excluded a priori. I was right to question religious dogma. I was wrong to assume that questioning led inevitably to rejection rather than sometimes to deeper understanding. The new edition published 3.5 years after my heart attack. The response was predictable. Atheists accused me of intellectual betrayal, Christians celebrated it as a powerful testimony, and philosophers debated whether it was admirable honesty or embarrassing inconsistency. But one response particularly moved me. It came from a graduate student who'd read the original edition years ago and had just read the new introduction. "Professor Harrison, I'm an atheist, and I'm probably going to stay one. But your new introduction did something I didn't expect. It made me respect religious believers more, because you showed that intelligent people can examine evidence honestly and reach different conclusions. that my atheism might be as much about my own biases and assumptions as about objective truth, that intellectual humility requires admitting I might be wrong. Thank you for that. Even if I never convert, I'll be a better, more honest atheist because of your example. That, I realized, was enough. I didn't need to convert everyone. I just needed to model what honest intellectual inquiry looked like. Following evidence even when it cost you everything, admitting when you were wrong, and being willing to revise your most deeply held beliefs. Around the same time, my relationship with the church deepened in unexpected ways. Reverend Sarah asked me to preach for the first time, not just share my testimony, but actually deliver a sermon. "I'm not ordained," I protested. "I'm barely 3 years into faith. I'm not qualified to preach." "David, you have a gift for making complex ideas accessible, and you have a story that needs to be told, not just once, but repeatedly, in different contexts. Preaching isn't about being perfect, it's about pointing people to Jesus, and you do that every time you speak." So I preached. The text was from John's Gospel, Jesus' encounter with Nicodemus, the religious teacher who came to him at night with questions. I talked about Nicodemus as someone who had his life figured out, a respected teacher, an expert in religious law, someone who thought he understood how God worked, and yet he came to Jesus with questions because something was incomplete in his understanding. Jesus told him, "You must be born again," I said, and Nicodemus was confused. How can someone be born when they are old? How can they start over? How can someone with an entire identity, an entire life built on certain assumptions, become something entirely new? And Jesus' answer is profound. He says, "Flesh gives birth to flesh, but the Spirit gives birth to spirit." In other words, you can't manufacture this transformation through your own effort. You can't think your way into it. You can't earn it or achieve it. It's a work of the Spirit. It's something that happens to you when you surrender to God. I understand Nicodemus deeply, because like him, I came to Jesus with a fully formed identity, professor, atheist, rationalist, someone who had it all figured out. And Jesus told me the same thing. You must be born again. The old David has to die, and someone new has to be born through the Spirit. And I resisted, because dying, even spiritually, is terrifying. Letting go of the identity you've built, the certainty you've cultivated, the reputation you've earned, that's death, and none of us want to die. But here's what I learned. The death Jesus asks for isn't destruction, it's transformation. It's not the end of who you are, but the beginning of who you were meant to be. The old David, the isolated, cynical, intellectually arrogant atheist, he had to die. But his death made possible the birth of someone new, someone who can love, connect, trust, surrender, someone who's actually alive instead of just existing. So if you're here today and you're like Nicodemus, you have your life figured out, you have your identity established, you have your understanding of how things work, I want to invite you to the same thing Jesus invited Nicodemus to. Die. Let the old you die. Let your certainties die. Let your self-sufficiency die. And be born again. Let the Spirit create something new in you. Something you could never create for yourself. It's terrifying, I know, because I've lived it, but it's also the most liberating thing you'll ever experience, because you'll finally be who you were created to be instead of who you tried to make yourself into. After the service, a man about my age approached me, tears streaming down his face. "I'm a doctor. I've spent my whole career being the rational one, the one with answers, the one in control, and I'm miserable. What you said about having to die, I think that's what I need, but I don't know how. You start by admitting you need it. That's the hardest part. The rest, Jesus does that. You just have to be willing." He nodded. "I'm willing. I think I'm finally willing." Reverend Sarah and I prayed with him right there in the church, and I watched as someone else began the journey I'd begun 3 years ago. From certainty to surrender, from self-sufficiency to dependence on God, from death to new life. These moments, the hospital visits, the conversations with skeptics, the chance to preach, the opportunities to walk with others through their own transformations, they gave my life a purpose I'd never had before. As a philosophy professor, I'd been imparting knowledge, but now I was participating in transformation, my own and others. That night, I prayed with a gratitude that had become my constant companion. Jesus, 3 years ago I died, and you gave me new life. But you didn't just give me life, you gave me purpose. You're using my story, my journey, my transformation to help others. Every person I talk to in the hospital who's had an NDE and is confused, I get to show them they're not alone. Every skeptic who reads my work and starts questioning their certainty, I get to model intellectual humility. Every person struggling to integrate faith and reason, I get to demonstrate it's possible. This isn't the life I planned. It's not the career I built. It's not the reputation I wanted, but it's the calling you gave me. And it's better than anything I could have designed for myself. Thank you for taking my worst mistake, 15 years of aggressive atheism, and redeeming it, for using even that to prepare me for this work, for showing me that nothing in my story is wasted, that you can use everything, even the years I spent running from you, for good. Keep using me, keep transforming me, keep making me into someone who can point others to you, not through perfect theology or flawless arguments, but through honest testimony about what you've done in my life. Because that's what people need to see, not perfection, but transformation, not certainty, but honest faith. Not someone who has it all figured out, but someone who met you and let you change everything. I'm 3 years into this journey, and I have so much further to go, so much more to learn, so much more transformation ahead. But I'm not afraid, because you've been faithful every step, and you'll be faithful in every step to come. Thank you for death that led to life. Thank you for brokenness that led to healing. Thank you for the 4 minutes that changed everything. I'm yours. Completely, for whatever you want to do with me, wherever you want to lead me, however you want to use my story. Just keep me humble, keep me honest, keep me dependent on you. Because the moment I think I have it figured out, that's when I become the old David again, the arrogant one, the self-sufficient one, the one who didn't need anyone, not even God. I never want to be that person again, so keep me broken enough to need you. Keep me humble enough to depend on you. Keep me surrendered enough to follow you. Thank you for everything, for meeting me, for saving me, for changing me, for using me. I'm home. After 41 years of running, I'm finally home, and I'm never leaving. 3 years after dying for 4 minutes, I had become someone I never could have imagined. Not just a believer, but someone whose life was being used to help others believe. Not just a convert, but someone whose conversion was helping others convert, or at least helping skeptics question their certainty and believers deepen their faith. Not just transformed, but someone participating in the transformation of others. The atheist philosopher had become a witness, not perfectly, not without struggles, not with all the answers, but authentically, honestly, humbly. And that, I was learning, was what God could use. Not perfect people, but willing ones. Not people with everything figured out, but people willing to follow even when they didn't understand. Not the certain, but the surrendered. And I was surrendered, completely, finally, home. 4 years after my heart attack, I received the kind of invitation that would have seemed impossible even 2 years earlier, to debate my former self. Not literally, of course, but a major university was hosting a symposium on near-death experiences and the limits of naturalism, and they wanted me to defend the reality of transcendent spiritual experience, while a prominent atheist philosopher, someone who'd cited my early work approvingly, would argue for purely naturalistic explanations. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. David Harrison, the former champion of atheism, debating on the side of spiritual reality against someone using the very arguments he'd once made. The symposium was at Princeton, and the auditorium was packed. Over 800 people, a mix of students, faculty, researchers, and curious observers. My opponent was Dr. Catherine Wells, a sharp philosopher of mind from MIT who'd written extensively on consciousness and reductionism. As we took our positions on stage, Catherine smiled at me with what seemed like genuine warmth. "David, I have to say this feels surreal. I used to assign your book in my classes. Now I'm arguing against you. How does that feel?" "Humbling. And honestly, I'm nervous. You're using my own arguments against me. You probably know them better than I do at this point. I promise to be respectful, but I'm also going to be rigorous. Your story is compelling, but I think the evidence still overwhelmingly supports naturalistic explanations for NDEs. The debate followed a standard format: opening statements, rebuttals, cross-examination, audience questions. Catherine went first. Her argument was sophisticated and well-constructed. She acknowledged the phenomenological reality of near-death experiences, that people genuinely experience what they report experiencing. But she argued this didn't require supernatural explanation any more than dreams or hallucinations did. "The brain, under extreme stress, does remarkable things," she said. "Oxygen deprivation triggers specific neural patterns. DMT release creates vivid hallucinations. Temporal lobe activity produces feelings of presence and transcendence. REM intrusion during cardiac arrest explains the narrative quality of NDEs. We have robust neurological explanations for every aspect of these experiences. Why posit an additional supernatural realm when natural processes suffice?" She then addressed my specific case. "Professor Harrison's experience was undoubtedly real to him, and I don't question his sincerity. But subjective certainty doesn't equal objective reality. People are absolutely certain about all sorts of things that aren't true. The question isn't whether his experience felt real. I'm sure it did. The question is whether it actually corresponded to an external supernatural reality or whether it was an internal neurological event. And the principle of parsimony suggests we should prefer the simpler explanation. When it was my turn, I took a different approach than I might have years ago. I didn't try to demolish her arguments. I tried to show their limitations. Dr. Wells makes a compelling case for naturalistic explanations. And she's right that we should prefer simpler explanations when they adequately account for all the data. But here's what I want to challenge. Do naturalistic explanations adequately account for all the data of near-death experiences? Or are we selectively explaining some features while dismissing others? Consider veridical perceptions during cardiac arrest. Multiple documented cases where people accurately described events during periods when they had no measurable brain activity. Dr. Wells's explanations don't account for this. They explain the subjective experience, but not the accurate perception of objective events. Consider the transformative effects. NDEs consistently produce lasting positive changes. Decreased fear of death, increased compassion, greater sense of meaning. Why would a hallucination produced by a dying brain create these specific changes? Why not random changes or negative changes? Consider the cross-cultural consistency. People from vastly different backgrounds report remarkably similar core features: the tunnel, the light, the presence, the life review. If these were just cultural constructs, we'd expect more variation. I'm not saying naturalistic explanations are wrong. I'm saying they're incomplete. They account for some data while leaving significant questions unanswered. And in my own case, they don't account for the encounter with a being who knew things about my life I'd never told anyone, who showed me perspectives on events I'd never considered, who transformed me in ways that 4 years later continue to deepen rather than fade. The cross-examination was intense, but respectful. Catherine pressed me on specific points. "David, you talk about encountering Jesus, but how do you know it was Jesus and not just a construct of your own mind, your brain creating a figure to embody transcendence?" 2 reasons. First, it wasn't what I expected. I had no religious background, no emotional attachment to Christianity. If my brain was constructing a comforting figure, why Jesus specifically? Second, the encounter conveyed information I didn't have, perspectives on my life I'd never considered, knowledge about my impact on students that I'd never thought about. It wasn't just a mirror of my own thoughts, it was genuinely other. But couldn't that other perspective come from your subconscious, your brain processing information you'd gathered but never consciously integrated? Possibly. That's a fair hypothesis, but it doesn't account for the lasting transformation. 4 years later, I'm not the same person. Not just different beliefs, but fundamentally different character. More patient, more compassionate, more connected. If this was just my subconscious, why would it produce such specific and lasting changes? Because you wanted to change. You were unhappy in your isolation. Your brain gave you an experience that justified the change you already wanted to make. That's clever. But Dr. Wells, I didn't consciously want to change. I was proud of my isolation. I saw it as intellectual independence. The transformation wasn't something I sought. It was something that happened to me. And it continues to happen, in ways that often surprise me and aren't always comfortable. When the audience questions began, a graduate student asked something that shifted the entire conversation. Professor Harrison, you've talked about evidence for the reality of your experience, but you haven't addressed the strongest argument against it, the problem of evil. If you really encountered a loving God, how do you reconcile that with the suffering in the world? Doesn't the existence of evil provide stronger evidence against God than your NDE provides for God? It was the question I'd been dreading, because I didn't have a neat answer. 4 years of faith hadn't resolved the problem of evil for me. If anything, I felt it more acutely now that I believed in a loving God. You're right, I said slowly. The problem of evil is the strongest argument against theism, and I don't have a complete answer. What I can tell you is that when I encountered Jesus, I also encountered profound grief. Not just love, but sorrow. Sorrow over suffering, over pain, over everything broken in the world. And somehow, in that encounter, I understood that God doesn't stand apart from suffering. He enters into it. He bears it. The cross isn't just a doctrine, it's God's answer to evil. Not an explanation, but a participation. I paused, gathering my thoughts. That doesn't resolve all the philosophical problems. I still wrestle with why God allows suffering, but it changed the question for me. It's no longer, why would a good God allow evil? It's, what does it mean that God enters into evil and suffers with us? That's not a philosophical proof, but it's the beginning of a different way of thinking about the problem. Catherine responded thoughtfully. David, I appreciate your honesty, but doesn't this show the weakness of your position? You're admitting you can't fully answer one of the strongest objections to theism. Doesn't that suggest your belief is based more on wanting God to exist than on evidence? Maybe, or maybe it suggests that some realities are too complex to be fully grasped by philosophical argument alone. I don't have a complete theodicy, but I have an encounter with a being who is both perfectly loving and intimately acquainted with suffering. That doesn't resolve all my intellectual questions, but it gives me a framework for living with those questions rather than needing everything answered before I can believe. After the debate during the reception, something unexpected happened. Catherine approached me privately. David, can I be honest with you? Off the record. Of course. Deet, I found your arguments more compelling than I expected. Not because they're philosophically airtight, they're not, but because they're honest. You admitted limitations. You acknowledged problems you can't solve. You didn't pretend to have everything figured out, and that's refreshing. Most believers I debate are so certain they have an answer for everything, even when those answers are clearly inadequate. You're different. I don't know if that's a compliment or a criticism. She smiled. It's both. As a philosopher, I think your arguments have significant gaps, but as a person who values intellectual honesty, I respect that you're following your experience even when it doesn't resolve all your questions. That takes courage. Catherine, can I ask you something? Have you ever had an experience that challenged your materialism? Anything that made you wonder if there might be more? She was quiet for a long moment. Once, when my father died, I was with him in his final hours, and just before he passed, he opened his eyes and said he saw my mother, who died 5 years earlier. He said she was there in the room waiting for him, and he looked peaceful, joyful even. Then he was gone. What did you make of that? I explained it neurologically. Hallucinations are common at the end of life, the brain releasing chemicals, creating comforting visions. I wrote a paper about it, actually, using my father's death as a case study. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder, what if he really saw her? What if there was something there that my materialism can't account for? I've never told anyone that. It feels like admitting weakness. But your debate today, your willingness to hold intellectual questions alongside experiential certainty, it made me think maybe it's not weakness. Maybe it's honesty. We talked for another hour. Not debating, but genuinely exploring. She asked questions about my experience, about how I reconciled faith and reason, about how I lived with theological uncertainties, and I asked about her work on consciousness, about the hard problem, about whether she thought materialism could ultimately account for subjective experience. It wasn't a conversion. She remained unconvinced about God, but something shifted, a mutual respect, a recognition that we were both seeking truth honestly, even if we reached different conclusions. As I flew back to Boston, I reflected on how different this debate had been from the ones I'd participated in as an atheist. Back then, I debated to win, to demolish the opposition, to prove I was smarter, more rational, more intellectually sophisticated. But today, I debated to share truth as I'd experienced it, to be honest about limitations, to model what it looked like to hold conviction alongside humility. And somehow, that had been more effective than all my clever arguments had ever been. The next week, I received an email from a student who'd attended the debate. "Professor Harrison, I'm a biology major and a lifelong atheist. I went to the debate expecting to watch Dr. Wells destroy your arguments, and intellectually, I think she had the stronger case. But something about your presentation shook me. Not because you proved God exists, I don't think you did, but because you showed me that intelligent people can have experiences that challenge their worldview, and have the courage to follow those experiences even at great personal cost. I'm not converting, but I'm less certain than I was, and I think that's progress. Thank you." That email meant more to me than if she'd said I'd won the debate, because the goal wasn't winning. It was helping people see that the questions about God, consciousness, meaning, and spiritual experience were more complex than either militant atheism or dogmatic religion acknowledged. That honest inquiry required humility from both sides. Around this time, my work at the hospital expanded. Father Michael asked if I'd be willing to train other chaplains and hospital staff on how to talk with patients about near-death experiences. Most medical professionals don't know what to do when a patient reports an NDE, he explained. They either dismiss it as hallucination or get uncomfortable because it's too spiritual for a medical setting. But these experiences are real, phenomenologically real, to the people having them. They need to be addressed with both medical competence and spiritual sensitivity. So I developed a training program. I taught medical staff about the neuroscience of NDEs, the current research, the leading theories, the areas of ongoing debate. But I also taught them to listen to the phenomenological reports without dismissing them, to respect the subjective reality of the experience even while offering medical explanations, to refer patients to chaplains or counselors when the experience raised spiritual questions they needed to process. One session particularly struck me. A trauma nurse asked, "How do you balance medical explanation with spiritual interpretation? Don't they contradict each other?" "Not necessarily," I said. Medical explanation tells us what's happening in the brain during an NDE. Spiritual interpretation addresses whether there's also something happening beyond the brain. Both can be true simultaneously. The question is whether brain activity creates the experience or mediates an experience of something real beyond itself. But how do you know which it is? You can't know definitively from external observation, but the person having the experience often has strong intuitions about it, and those intuitions deserve respect, even if they can't be scientifically verified. Your job isn't to convince patients their experience was just their brain. It's to help them process what they experienced, whatever they believe it means. This training became unexpectedly popular. Hospitals around the region started requesting it, and I found myself teaching medical professionals the same thing I taught philosophy students, that mystery exists, that certainty is often false confidence, and that holding space for questions is more valuable than insisting on answers. 4 years after dying for 4 minutes, my life had become a strange fusion of worlds. I was a philosophy professor who taught about God, a former atheist who counseled believers, a researcher who valued both science and spiritual experience, a skeptic who'd encountered something that shattered his skepticism. And I was learning that this in-between space, neither purely secular nor traditionally religious, neither completely certain nor hopelessly confused, was exactly where I needed to be, because it allowed me to speak to both sides, to translate between worlds, to show that the dichotomy between reason and faith was often false. That Sunday, I preached again at Revenge, Sarah's invitation. The text was from John's Gospel, Jesus' prayer in John the 17, "Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth." Truth, I said to the congregation. Jesus prayed that his followers would be sanctified, set apart, made holy by truth, not by comfort, not by certainty, not by having all the answers, by truth. For 41 years, I thought I knew what truth was. I thought truth was what could be scientifically verified, empirically measured, rationally proven. And that's one kind of truth. It's important, it's valuable, but it's not the whole truth, because truth also includes the things we experience but can't prove, the things we know in our hearts but can't demonstrate in a lab, the encounters that transform us even when we can't explain them to others. When I died 4 years ago, I encountered truth, not an argument or a proposition, but a person. Jesus said, "I am the truth." And when you meet truth personally, it changes everything. It doesn't answer all your questions. It doesn't resolve all your doubts, but it gives you a foundation that's more solid than any intellectual certainty. So if you're seeking truth today, I want to encourage you. Don't settle for easy answers from either side. Don't let atheists tell you that only material reality is real, but also don't let religious people tell you that you can't have questions or doubts. Seek truth honestly. Follow evidence wherever it leads. And be open to the possibility that truth might be someone you meet, rather than just something you think. After the service, a woman in her 30s approached me with tears in her eyes. "I've been a Christian my whole life, but I've always been afraid to ask questions because I thought doubt was sin. What you said, that seeking truth honestly might include doubt, that's freeing. Maybe I don't have to have perfect faith. Maybe I can follow Jesus while still having questions." "That's exactly right," I told her. "Faith isn't the absence of questions. It's trust in the midst of questions. Jesus welcomes our doubts. He met Thomas in his doubt. He'll meet you in yours." These conversations, in hospital rooms and debate halls, in churches and classrooms, with skeptics and believers, they were becoming my life's work. Not systematic theology, not rigorous apologetics, but honest testimony, vulnerable sharing, walking with people through their questions while being transparent about my own. That night, I prayed with gratitude that had become deeper and richer over 4 years. Jesus, 4 years ago, you met me when I died, and you've been meeting me every day since, in hospital rooms and debate stages, in moments of doubt and moments of certainty, in questions I can answer and questions I can't. Thank you for not demanding I have everything figured out before I can serve you. Thank you for using my weakness, my questions, my doubts, my ongoing struggles, as much as my strengths. Thank you for making me a bridge between worlds that usually don't speak to each other. Thank you for the atheists who hear my story and start questioning their certainty. Thank you for the believers who hear my story and feel permission to doubt. Thank you for everyone I get to walk with through their own encounters with mystery. Keep me humble. Keep me honest. Keep me dependent on you. Because the moment I think I have it all figured out, I've stopped seeking truth, and you are truth, living, personal, mysterious truth that I'll spend the rest of my life getting to know better. 4 years in, and I'm just beginning to understand how much I don't understand, how much deeper this goes than I realized, how much more transformation is ahead. But I'm not afraid, because you're with me. You've been faithful through every step, and you'll be faithful through every step to come. Thank you for death that led to life. Thank you for questions that lead to deeper truth. Thank you for 4 years of learning to live in mystery instead of certainty. I'm yours, forever yours, following wherever you lead, trusting even when I don't understand. Because I've met you, and having met truth personally, I can't go back to just having opinions about truth. You've ruined me for anything less than reality, and for that, I'm eternally grateful. 4 years after 4 minutes changed everything, the journey continued, deeper, richer, more mysterious, into truth that was a person, into questions that led to greater understanding, into a life that was finally, truly, alive. 5 years after my heart attack, I stood on a Cambridge sidewalk on a cold October morning, the exact spot where I'd collapsed and died 5 years ago to the day. I'd come here deliberately, wanting to mark the anniversary in the place where everything changed. The sidewalk looked the same. People hurried past on their way to work just as they had that morning. The medical student who'd performed CPR had long since graduated. The witnesses had moved on with their lives. To everyone else, this was just another piece of pavement in Cambridge. But to me, it was sacred ground, the place where the old David Harrison died, the place where God reached down and gave me 4 minutes that would define the rest of my life. I knelt down and touched the concrete, remembering the crushing pain in my chest, the sudden separation from my body, the journey to a place beyond description. Jesus, his eyes, his love, his invitation to surrender everything and follow him. 5 years, half a decade since I'd been dead and come back different. A voice interrupted my reflection. Professor Harrison? I looked up to see a young woman, maybe mid-20s, standing a few feet away. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, but I recognized you. I was here 5 years ago. I'm the one who did CPR. My heart stopped, metaphorically this time. You saved my life. Dr. Emily Chen now. I just finished my residency. But yes, I was a third-year medical student that morning. I was on my way to clinical rotation when you collapsed. I've thought about you so many times over the years, wondered if you made it, how you were doing. Emily, I don't even know what to say. Thank you doesn't seem adequate. You don't have to thank me. I just did what I was trained to do. But actually, there's something I need to tell you, something that's bothered me for 5 years. What is it? You were dead, Professor. Completely dead. No pulse, no breathing, no response. I did compressions for what felt like forever before the paramedics arrived, and even after they shocked you, you didn't come back right away. You were gone for over 4 minutes. According to everything I learned in medical school, you shouldn't be here. Or if you survived, you should have severe brain damage. But I don't. No, you don't. In fact, I've followed your work, the book, the lectures, the testimony about what happened while you were gone. Professor Harrison, I need to know, was it real? Did something actually happen during those 4 minutes? Or is it possible it was constructed afterward, your brain filling in gaps? I stood up, brushing off my knees. Emily, can I buy you coffee? This conversation deserves more than a sidewalk. We found a cafe nearby, ironically, one I used to frequent as an atheist professor, where I'd graded papers and prepared lectures dismissing the very experience I'd later have. Over coffee, I told her everything. Not the public version I shared in talks, but the raw, detailed account. Every sensation, every moment of the encounter with Jesus, every word spoken into my heart, every revelation about my life, every transformative insight. The question you're asking, I said, is the question I've wrestled with for 5 years. How do I know it was real, and not just my brain's last electrical firings creating a comforting narrative? And here's my honest answer. I can't prove it to you. I can't provide objective evidence that would satisfy scientific standards. What I can tell you is that 5 years later, the experience hasn't faded. It's become more real, not less. And the transformation it produced in me, from an isolated, cynical atheist to someone capable of love, connection, and surrender, that transformation is evidence that something profound happened. Emily listened intently. As a doctor, I'm trained to explain everything medically, but as someone who was there that morning, who felt your lifeless body under my hands, who knows how long you were gone, I've always wondered if there was more. If maybe we don't understand everything about consciousness and death and what happens in between. What do you believe, Emily? I don't know. I was raised Buddhist, but I'm not particularly religious. I believe in science, in evidence, in rational explanations, but I've also seen things in medicine that I can't fully explain. Patients who shouldn't survive but do. People who wake from comas with stories of experiences during the time they were unconscious. Your case is one of dozens I've encountered that make me question whether materialism has all the answers. So what are you going to do with that questioning? She smiled. Keep being a good doctor. Keep following the evidence. And stay open to the possibility that reality is bigger and stranger than my medical training suggested. That's all I can do, right? That's exactly what you should do. Don't force yourself to believe something you don't. But don't dismiss experiences, yours or others, just because they don't fit your current framework. Stay open, stay curious, stay humble. After Emily left, I remained in the cafe, thinking about how God had orchestrated even this encounter. 5 years to the day, the woman who'd saved my life appearing at the exact spot where I died. It felt like a gift, a reminder, a confirmation that none of this had been random. That evening, I was back at Grace Community Church for a special service Reverend Sarah had organized, a 5-year anniversary celebration of my testimony. The sanctuary was packed with people who'd been part of my journey. Robert Chen, who'd first believed me, James Morrison and others I'd counseled through their own near-death experiences. Students whose lives had been changed by my story, members of the atheist student group who'd been watching my transformation with fascination. Even Tyler Morrison, the student who'd walked out of my first post-conversion class, was there, now a graduate student studying philosophy of religion himself. Reverend Sarah invited me to share. David, 5 years ago, you died and met Jesus. Tonight, tell us, what have you learned in these 5 years of following him? I stood before the congregation, overwhelmed with gratitude and humility. 5 years ago, I was the most arrogant person I knew. I thought I had reality figured out. I thought anyone who believed in God was either stupid or dishonest. I thought death was the end, consciousness was just brain activity, and meaning was an illusion we created to make ourselves feel better about our cosmic insignificance. Then I died, and everything I believed was shattered in 4 minutes. These 5 years have been the most difficult and most beautiful of my life. Difficult because transformation is painful, because admitting you were wrong about everything is humbling, because following Jesus costs you things, reputation, relationships, the certainty that made you feel safe, but beautiful because I'm finally alive, really alive. Not the half-life I lived before, where I was just a brain analyzing reality from a distance, but fully alive, connected to God, connected to others, connected to purpose beyond myself. What have I learned? I've learned that intellectual honesty sometimes means following evidence that contradicts your worldview. I've learned that courage isn't the absence of doubt, but trusting God despite doubt. I've learned that transformation is a process, not an event. I'm still being changed, still discovering new areas of brokenness that need healing, still learning what it means to surrender. I've learned that the questions don't all get answered. 5 years in, I still wrestle with the problem of evil. I still have moments of doubt. I still struggle to understand why God allows suffering. But I've learned that I can hold questions and faith simultaneously. That not having all the answers doesn't mean abandoning the truth I've encountered. Most importantly, I've learned that Jesus is real, not just a historical figure or a theological concept, but a living person who meets us, loves us, transforms us, who enters into our suffering instead of standing apart from it, who welcomes our doubts and questions and meets us in them. I spent 41 years running from him, building intellectual fortresses against him, convincing myself and others he didn't exist. And when I finally met him, he didn't condemn me for that. He welcomed me, showed me love I didn't deserve, invited me into relationship I'd spent decades denying was even possible. That's the gospel, not that we're good enough to reach God, but that God reaches down to us. Not that we have it all figured out, but that we surrender to someone who does. Not that we're perfect, but that we're loved despite our imperfection. 5 years ago, the atheist philosopher died on a Cambridge sidewalk, and someone new was born. Someone who's still learning, still growing, still being transformed, but someone who's finally truly alive. The congregation stood and applauded. But more than applause, there were tears, people weeping, not sad tears, but tears of recognition, of hope, of experiencing something true and beautiful. After the service, dozens of people shared their own stories with me. A woman who'd lost her husband and been questioning God's goodness. A teenager struggling to reconcile science and faith. A former believer who'd walked away from Christianity and was reconsidering. A lifelong atheist who'd come out of curiosity and was starting to wonder if there might be something more. Each conversation reminded me why God had sent me back. Not just for my own transformation, but to help others on their journeys. To show that doubt doesn't have to lead to unbelief. That intellectual rigor and spiritual faith aren't enemies. That transformation is possible for anyone, even the most hardened skeptic. Late that night, alone in my apartment, I reflected on 5 years of journey. I thought about what I'd lost. My reputation as a serious atheist philosopher, some friendships, the certainty that had defined my identity for 4 decades. And I thought about what I'd gained: relationship with Jesus, genuine connections with others, purpose beyond professional achievement, peace that didn't depend on circumstances, joy rooted in something deeper than temporary pleasure. The trade had been worth it, more than worth it. I opened my laptop and began writing, not another book, but a letter to myself, to the David Harrison I'd been 5 years ago. The one who'd walked to campus that October morning, confident in his atheism, certain of his worldview, completely unaware that in minutes everything would change. Dear past David, in a few minutes you're going to collapse on a Cambridge sidewalk. Your heart will stop, you will die, and it will be the best thing that ever happens to you. I know you won't believe that. You don't believe in anything beyond material reality. You think death is the end. You're certain that consciousness is just brain activity, and that when the brain stops, you stop. You're wrong about all of it. You're about to discover that reality is far bigger, stranger, and more beautiful than your naturalism could account for. You're about to meet someone you've spent 15 years denying exists. And he's going to show you love that will shatter every defense you've built, every certainty you've clung to, every wall you've constructed to protect yourself from vulnerability. It's going to be terrifying. You're going to resist. You're going to try to explain it away. You're going to struggle with whether to be honest about what happened or to dismiss it to preserve your worldview and reputation. Choose honesty. I'm begging you, choose honesty. Yes, you'll lose things. Your reputation as the campus atheist, some colleagues' respect, the certainty that made you feel intellectually superior. the identity you've built over 41 years. But you'll gain so much more. You'll gain truth, relationship, community, purpose, peace, joy. You'll gain the knowledge that when you die, really die permanently, you're going home to someone who loves you. You'll gain life, real life, not the isolated, cynical existence you're currently living and calling life, but abundant, connected, purposeful life. These 5 years ahead of you won't be easy. Transformation never is. You'll wrestle with doubt. You'll face criticism. You'll struggle to integrate your intellect with your faith. You'll discover wounds you didn't know you had, and will have to let Jesus heal them. But it will be worth it. Every difficulty, every cost, every uncomfortable moment of growth. Because you'll finally be who you were created to be, instead of who you tried to make yourself into. So when you wake up in that ambulance, when you're lying in the hospital bed trying to decide what to do with what you experienced, be brave, be honest, follow the truth wherever it leads, even when it costs you everything. You won't regret it. Love, future David, P.S. You're going to fall in love with Jesus. I know that sounds impossible to you right now, but it's true. 5 years from now, the most important relationship in your life will be with someone you currently insist doesn't exist. And it will be the most real, most transformative, most beautiful relationship you've ever had. That alone makes everything worth it. I saved the letter knowing I'd probably never share it publicly. It was just for me, a marker, a remembrance, a testament to how far I'd come. Then I knelt beside my bed, a posture that had gone from feeling ridiculous to feeling natural over 5 years, and prayed. Jesus, 5 years ago I died, and you gave me life. Not just physical life, though, thank you for that, but spiritual life, real life, life connected to you. Thank you for meeting me in my death. Thank you for loving me despite 15 years of denying you. Thank you for being patient with my doubts and questions. Thank you for transforming not just what I believe, but who I am. Thank you for Emily Chen, who saved my life physically. Thank you for every person you've brought into my path these 5 years. Robert, Sarah, the students, the patients, the skeptics, the believers. Each one a gift, each one part of how you've shaped me. Thank you for what I've lost. Yes, even that. Because losing my false certainties made room for real truth. Losing my reputation made room for real integrity. Losing my isolation made room for real connection. And thank you for what I've gained. Relationship with you, understanding that grows deeper every day. Purpose beyond myself. The privilege of helping others on their own journeys. 5 years in, and I'm just beginning, just starting to understand how much deeper this goes, how much more transformation is ahead, how much more of you there is to know. And I'm excited about that, not anxious, not afraid, but genuinely excited. Because if the past 5 years have taught me anything, it's that you're faithful, that you're good, that you're worth surrendering everything for. So here I am. 5 years after you raised me from death, still yours, still following, still being transformed. Use these next 5 years. Use the next 50 if you give them to me. Use however many days I have left, not for my glory, but for yours. Not to prove I'm right, but to point others to you. Not to build my reputation, but to share your love, because that's all that matters in the end. Not how many books I write or debates I win or students I teach, but how many people encounter you through my story. How many skeptics start questioning their certainty? How many believers find permission to doubt? How many people discover that transformation is possible? Thank you for death that led to life. Thank you for 4 minutes that changed everything. Thank you for 5 years of learning to live, surrendered to you. And thank you for whatever comes next, because I trust you, completely, finally. I'm yours, forever yours. The atheist philosopher who met you and could never be the same. The skeptic who encountered truth and was transformed. The man who died and discovered what it means to truly live. I'm home. After 41 years of running, I'm finally home, and I'm never leaving. Amen. 5 years after 4 minutes of death changed everything, David Harrison knelt in prayer. Not the man he'd been, not even the man he'd thought he'd become, but the man God was making him. Day by day, surrender by surrender, transformation by transformation, the atheist philosopher had died, and in his place was someone new, someone still learning, still growing, still discovering what it meant to follow Jesus, but someone who was finally, fully, completely alive. The journey was far from over. There were more questions to wrestle with, more doubts to work through, more transformations to undergo, more people to help, more of Jesus to know. But David was ready, because he'd learned the truth that changed everything. God goes before us, into death, into life, into everything. He'd met Jesus when he died, and he'd been meeting him every day since, in the questions and the certainties, in the doubts and the faith, in the struggles and the victories. Jesus was there, always there, leading him home, one step at a time, one day at a time, one surrender at a time, into life abundant, into truth incarnate, into love that would never let him go. The 4 minutes were over, but the life they'd given him was just beginning, and it would continue for as long as God gave him breath, pointing others to the one who'd met him in death and given him life, the one who was worth everything, Jesus, always Jesus, forever.